The world of Telvaria had been embroiled in the fires of war for countless millennia. It was the result of the feuds of the many gods of the world, but mainly because of the endless squabbles between the nine, the preeminent gods of the universe. They were the greatest beings in existence, the creators and the destroyers of everything. Billions of years ago, they had formed out of the cosmic ether, and bent their will towards the creation of a world for themselves, a world that rapidly turned into nothing more than a playground. Even gods grow bored, perhaps at an even quicker rate than mortals. Over the years, civilization had developed on the planet of Telvaria, the seat of the gods' power. A myriad of races, from humans to far more exotic creatures, lived and died under the watchful eyes of their masters, never knowing why they existed. Of course, the only reason was quite clear. They were there to please their makers, and nothing more. 8 of the gods, known as the gods of light, were in an alliance against the 9th of their siblings, the sovereign of the apocalypse, Sarnathros. It was because of this that war had never ended in the universe. However, if there was any time for it to finish, it was coming near. The forces of Sarnathros were on the back foot, pushed back to their capital. If nothing changed, the god would be banished from existence, as the last of his followers died. However, unbeknownst to his siblings, he had a plan. Sarnathros sat brooding in the midst of his citadel, in his personal cosmic realm. The god was bitter, from long years of conflict, but also from the knowledge that his tenure as a god would soon be coming to a close. His only hope was to summon a champion to this world, a task that was far more arduous than it seemed. You see, to do such a thing, a god had to sacrifice a portion of their own soul into the ritual, and if this did not pay off, Sarnathros would be weakened to the point of nothingness. However, if it did work, he would be richly rewarded. Rising from his throne, ignoring the majestic views of outer space from the mile-long windows in front of him, the god walked towards a ritual circle inscribed on the floor. It did not look like much, more like a child's scrawl than anything else, but within its tangled lines and oblique angles, there lay inordinate power. He was the only person left in his entire divine faction, with his many children long since having died to the forces of the light. He was the last of his kind, and it weighed heavily on his soul. His only balm now was the promise of revenge, or oblivion. At this point, either would be welcome. He had lived for far longer than he should have, and the weight of the eons was only now starting to take hold. He pushed gently off the ground, levitating the rest of the way until he hovered over the center of the circle. Holding his hands out to each side, he began. O forces of the universe, infinity, eternity, and creation, I call upon you. Lend me your power and reach across the cosmic divide to bring me a champion. His voice was not at all what a god's should be, sounding more like a school teacher than anything else. However, only his siblings possessed the supreme ego that afflicted immortals. He was of a more mellow disposition. Although he was renowned as the ultimate evil by the people of Telvaria, his true followers knew that as the lie it was. His siblings had committed far worse atrocities than him, driven by their self-centered demand for purity at all costs. Of course, morality, when seen by a god, is purely in the eye of the beholder. Sarnathros started to shudder as his soul tore within him, sending tendrils of golden light into the circle beneath him. The tangled lines began to glow with baleful power, and a pillar of light shot up into the heavens, piercing through the edge of the universe and into another. Sarnathros collapsed backwards, his power spent. As he looked up at the scintillating beacon of rainbow energy, he could only hope that it would save him. Jonathan Harlow whistled aimlessly as he drummed his hands on his steering wheel. He had been a truck driver for the last 5 years, and had had to deal with an endless amount of monotony, ornery suppliers, and incompetent drivers who always seemed to think that they knew more than him. It was a hard life, but one that he had gotten used to over the years. As his truck trundled down the moonlit lane, his concentration started to slip, and he began to daydream of what he would do with his time off. Some sleep would be nice for starters. After that, he would treat himself to something, maybe a nice meal. A creaking noise jolted him out of his daydream, and he looked up, only to see a monolithic shape bearing down on his truck. The last thing he thought before the tree hit his truck was how mad his boss would be about the late delivery. Then everything faded to darkness, and he knew no more. Some time later, Jonathan came to in a dark void, surrounded by nothing. Not blackness, but true nothingness. It was impossible to explain, and his mind almost broke just looking at it. However, he was made out of sterner stuff, and he marshaled his rampaging psyche before he could lose himself. Taking deep breaths, he studied the world around him. There wasn't really that much to see. The only break in the monotony of nothingness was a small button hovering in the middle of the air, glowing with a faint golden light. Jonathan floated over to it, not exactly sure of how he achieved that feat, and pressed it. It was a hasty decision, but it was the only possible way out of here as far as he could tell. Immediately, the world shifted and changed. He was standing in the middle of an onyx citadel, completely alone. Lonely towers of black rock rose out of medieval buildings, piercing the heavens with their gnarled ends. Around him was an empty square, perhaps somewhere that was used as a marketplace by the inhabitants. Nothing stirred around him, save for a bell tolling in the distance. As he looked around, he saw that everything was made out of onyx, even the trees around himself. A moment later, the ground started to shake, and 3 statues rose out of the ground in front of him. Each one was patterned after a different thing, one of them a burly brute wielding a large axe, another a robed being with a staff, and the final one was a slim figure with a bow. Jonathan frowned as he saw these. They looked oddly similar to the basic classes in some of the video games that he had played. A warrior, a mage and a ranger. Had he been transported into some fantasy world? Or was this all some dream caused by that tree falling onto him? Perhaps he was dying, and this was the last gasp of his failing brain, trying to keep him conscious. In any case, he had nothing to lose by inspecting them. As he neared the first one, the burly brute, a strange blue sheet appeared in front of him, with words on it. The words were in an alien, almost runic alphabet, but as he watched, they swirled in front of him until they were legible. Warrior, Tier 1 class. You are a brute, but one that is effective at his job. A warrior is made to take damage and deal damage in equal measure, relying on pure brute strength over all else. Of course, some durability never hurts as well. Be prepared for a life of sideways glances from snooty mages, convinced of their intellectual superiority. +2 to strength, +2 to resilience per level. Jonathan frowned at this. If he didn't know better, he would have said that the message was mocking him. How could mere letters floating in the air have any sort of animus though? In any case, his suspicions about this being a fantasy world were proven right. Before picking anything, he moved on to the next option. Mage, Tier 1 class. You are an effete academic, always buried in his studies. However, those who scorn you will soon learn the errors of their ways. You can obliterate armies with bolts of fire and ice, tear apart cities with your might. But not at this level. Starting out, you will barely be able to light a fire or chill a drink. You really didn't think that earlier part was serious, did you? +2 to intelligence, +2 to wisdom per level. Jonathan snorted at the message, noting that whatever was creating the words had a sense of humor. Before he could move on to the next one and check it out, the world around him started to tremble. But I didn't select anything. He cried out, afraid that he had accidentally picked something preemptively. However, the shaking stabilized, and another statue arose out of the ground. This one was of a weaponless, armorless man, holding his bare hands out in supplication. However, something about the statue told Jonathan that this option was vastly superior to the others. Almost in a trance, he walked over to it, and read the resulting message. Outsider, Tier 1 class. As the first being from another universe to visit Telveria in eons, you are marked for greater things. Passing through the astral divide has imbued you with power beyond your ken, potential that will slowly be revealed as time goes on. For now, enjoy the benefits of your baptism by the void. +2 to all stats per level, plus 3 additional free points. Jonathan's eyes bulged as he read this. It was by far the most powerful class out of the ones that he had already seen. If he didn't pick this one, he would be doing himself a great disservice, even if this was all just the hallucinations of his oxygen-starved brain. Jonathan took a deep breath, and mentally accepted the class. Unsure of whether this would work, he waited apprehensively. A moment later, the statue crumbled into dust, and a wave of power entered him. Around him, the onyx citadel shattered, and there was a flare of white light before nothingness claimed him once more. A second, or an eternity, later, Jonathan was standing on the top of a green hill. All around him was a rolling, pastoral landscape, dotted with small villages and homesteads. If this was a fantasy world, it was quite clearly a peaceful one. A scrolling message appeared in his vision. "Greetings, my chosen. You have been selected for a great destiny, one that is rivaled by none. I am Sarnathros, one of the gods of this world, and I desperately need your help. My brethren have waged war against me for countless years, whittling away my power as they went. Soon, I will be no more, just like my children. My power brought you here, and by my power you shall rise. I have arranged a few bonuses for you as well, in order to facilitate your rise. To begin, simply think the word status." The message disappeared, leaving Jonathan standing there on the hilltop, as the wind whistled around his head. Before he could lose himself to indecision, he followed the message's instructions. As soon as he thought the word status, however, the ground around him rumbled. "There you are, filth. I knew that my brother had summoned one of your kind, although I could not find you until now. Enjoy your stay in the infinite hells." A sonorous voice boomed down from the sky, rattling Jonathan's brain in his skull. Such was its volume that his nose bled. A moment later, there was a crack and then a bolt of lightning struck Jonathan, frying his body to ash in an instant. He had died. All Jonathan knew for the next eon was nothingness, and pain. He was suffused with a hellish, orange light that seemed to burn away his very soul. All of that time, he had the vague sense that he was floating downward. He knew that something was trying to break his mind and will, and he tried desperately to combat that. Eventually, he felt something small and spiny detach itself from his neck, wailing in fury as its hold on him was broken. Then all he knew was true blackness. Reality came back to him in waves. First there was the smell. A tarry, sulfurous odor that entered his nose and seemed to stay there, trying to work its way into his brain. Jonathan coughed as the smell redoubled, and he nearly vomited. He was stronger than that, however, and he mastered his senses as the next of them returned. A sound unlike anything he had ever heard before battered his ears, the sound of a million wailing children mixed with screams of utter agony. Jonathan flinched, but remained strong. After all, he was here for a greater purpose. Perhaps this was the meaning that he had long craved. After hearing came his sense of touch. A fiery heat burned at his skin as it returned, sending spikes of pain into his body. Jonathan grimaced and bore it as well as he could, realizing that although it was uncomfortable, it could not hurt him. After that, his tongue began to register the taste of burnt meat, and he gagged, realizing that he was tasting burning flesh in the air. Finally, and worst of all, was his sight. He was standing in the middle of an endless line that extended into the horizon in either direction. All around him was a desolate wasteland of ash, and nothing but ash. Drifts of the gray substance lined the ground, and massive mountains of ash were visible in the distance. Strange shapes moved in the corners of his eyes, and Jonathan cringed. In the distance, one of the mountains shifted, revealing a titanic head, shaped like a saw. Grimacing, he turned his head back towards his place in the line. Every now and again, a winged creature would swoop down and carry off one of the people waiting in the line, and as the one in front of him was taken, Jonathan realized that it had not been human. The creature had been too slender for that, with long, pointed fingers, and a vaguely triangular head. Most convincingly, however, it had sported 4 arms. As a hideous screech carried to Jonathan's ears, he realized that one of the monsters was coming for him too. As it passed overhead, he ducked, and lashed out with his hand. He felt stronger and faster somehow, as if he had been infused with energy. As his hand moved, he clasped it onto the creature's leg. It was hot to the touch, burning his skin, but compared to the pain from his descent, it was nothing. He pulled it down out of the air, using the element of surprise to overpower its wings. It scrabbled at his arms with its long claws, drawing blood, but he ignored it to the best of his abilities, instead taking a good look at it. It looked like a massive, humanoid bat, with a face made out of twisted sinew and bone. It screeched directly at him, sending a spike of pain into his head. Before he could do anything, it flapped off, escaping his grip. As it left, he saw something strange over its head. Ash Imp, Basic. Level 3. That was all he saw, but it was enough. He knew the name of the monster, and how powerful it was. Assuming that he was level 1, Jonathan was quite a bit stronger than his level indicated. Then he remembered what he had been doing before he had been killed. Checking his status. Before he could think of it, however, a sudden wave of dread washed over his body, as he remembered his own death. Although the lightning bolt had struck in the blink of an eye, every aspect of his hideous demise was still etched into his soul. He remembered his screams, the feeling of his limbs turning to dust. The pain that had quickly turned into something even worse. Oblivion. The feeling quickly turned into a stark and vivid hatred for whatever had done that to him. He knew that it had been one of the siblings of his patron, Sarnathros. That meant that it had been another god. As he stood there, his feet buried in ash, and with the screeches of demons flying overhead, he vowed that he would have his revenge. Blood dripped down from his hands as he stood there, but he didn't notice the fact that his fingernails had pierced his own flesh. Instead, he smiled grimly. He was in the infinite hells, wherever they were. He would escape this place and get his revenge, or die trying. With a quick thought, a screen appeared in front of him. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Basic. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 1. 3 free points. Strength. 15. Dexterity. 15. Constitution. 18. Resilience. 18. Intelligence. 15. Wisdom. 13. Divinity. 1. Health 180/180. Stamina 150/150. Mana 150/150. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, Unique. Nascent Divinity, Celestial. Wretch, Common. Skills. Identify, Common. Nothing else was written there, but that did not concern Jonathan at the moment. What he wanted to find out more about were his titles. Opening the first one, he was met with yet another blue screen. Chosen of Sarnathros, Unique. You have been chosen by a god, and wrenched from your universe to serve his will. Such things come with benefits. Bonuses: immunity to divine possession, loyalty of all true followers of Sarnathros, and better class options. Jonathan closed the notice and took a deep breath. So that was what the message from earlier had been talking about, not that it did him much good anyway, stuck in this universe version of hell as he was. He doubted that he would find any followers of Sarnathros among the listless, brain-dead shells that surrounded him. As he stood there, had begun to notice that not a single one of the people around him seemed self-aware, or even conscious. Instead, they simply stood there, waiting to be snatched up by the imps. It was as if their minds had broken. Then Jonathan remembered the pain he had felt during his descent into this place. Perhaps that was why none of these people were conscious. They had already been broken on the way here. Another one of the imps came screeching down towards him, and Jonathan remained still until the last moment, tricking the creature into thinking him no better off than the others. Instead, it took his fist directly into its face, sending it hurtling backwards. It crashed into a nearby ash drift, and Jonathan stared at his fist in amazement. He was definitely stronger than before. The monster got to its feet unsteadily, and stared at him through its burning eyes, before launching itself back at him. It certainly did not seem especially intelligent. In any case, Jonathan was better off finding his way out of this endless line, as it seemed as if the imps were attracted to the masses of people waiting there. He began running, his feet sinking deep into the ash. Luckily it was exceedingly light, or his progress would have been impeded. As the imp came in for another pass, its leathery wings beating audibly, Jonathan whirled around and snatched it out of the air by its neck. Before it could do anything, he snapped its neck, killing the creature. A wave of energy entered him a moment later, and he took a deep breath, trying to get as much of it into him as he could. He had no idea what it was, but it felt good. The energy crashed into a dam within his body, and shattered it a moment later. His skin briefly glowed with light, and his wounds healed over. You have killed an ash imp. You have leveled up. A surge of power rushed through his body, and he felt his muscles elongating and becoming larger. That was only the most noticeable change, and he was sure that many more were occurring within him. He had a few spare points to allocate as well, and Jonathan briefly considered which of his stats to put them into. It was surprising how easily all of this came to him, but his apprehension of the new world had already been broken by his death. Now, he was fully invested in it. What he needed now, most of all, was survivability. For that, he had two options: durability, or offensive capability. He could always branch out later, especially with his universal stat bonuses per level, but for now he needed to maximize his potential. He also found the divinity stat to be interesting, seeing as it only had a single point in it. However, when he tried to add to it, it did not work. Perhaps it was a stat that could only be raised through extraordinary means. With a quick thought, he split the points between strength and dexterity. His stats related to durability, or at least what he believed resilience and constitution to be for, were already higher than the others. What happened next was surprising. Rather than gaining a flat 3 points in each stat, he actually gained 4. There was no apparent reason for this, but as he ran, he opened up his next title description. Perhaps there was an explanation there. Nascent divinity, celestial. A god walks among us. Or rather, the barest shadow of what a god could be. In your momentous journey between universes, and your subsequent descent into the infinite hells, something awakened within you, something that should not have been. Your outsider nature prevented the gods' restrictions of the emergence of new gods, allowing you to step on their path. Bonuses, plus 25% to all stats, access to divinity stat. If what this said was true, Jonathan was now a god, if only in the most basic of senses. Still, it seemed that gods were able to die, and if he did not want this to happen to him, it was time to get somewhere a bit safer. As he dashed across the ash, he could feel the effects of his stats propelling him faster than he could ever have dreamed of before coming to this universe. He had always been quite a fit man, and he had not been a weakling by any sense of the word, but he was still not any sort of athlete. Now it seemed, he was. The line of people vanished behind an ash drift, and Jonathan slowed down somewhat, noting that his stamina was rapidly dropping. It functioned exactly as could be expected, gauging his endurance. Now that he was going more slowly, the number stopped ticking down, instead hovering at a steady amount. Jonathan ran for over an hour, only seeing more of the monotonous ash. The mountains in the distance weren't getting any closer, and if he wasn't so sure of himself, he would have said that he was running in circles. Curious to his last title, Jonathan opened his status sheet. Wretch, common. You are one of the dregs of the universe, fit only for endless torture. During your life, you were a sinner, or even worse, an enemy of the gods. As a result, you were sent to the infinite hells when you died. You may not escape your punishment in any way. That explained why he felt like he was running in circles. There was no escape from this place. Then another message appeared, unbidden. You are under the influence of a negative title. Do you wish to remove it? Y/N. Jonathan instantly hit yes, and the title vanished from his status. Suddenly, the mountains began to grow larger in his vision. If he was not mistaken, the reason why he had been able to remove the title was because it had not been intended to be read. None of the others that he had left behind were even conscious, and there was no way that they would be able to read their own titles. As a result, they would never be able to escape, not that they would have been able to in the first place. In any case, he was now free. However, even with his new unfettered status, there wasn't all that much to see. Then he crossed over an unseen barrier, and an entire world revealed itself to him. The ground was still the same, an endless expanse of ash, but it was suddenly filled with monsters and an infinite array of ruins, seemingly from all manner of styles and civilizations. And some of those monsters had noticed Jonathan. One of the nearest ones to him, a two-headed dog-like monster with a ruff of flayed skin around its neck, howled as it saw him, before running full tilt towards him. Its speed told him that it was no normal beast, and he quickly scanned it with his skill. Ash Prowler, Basic. Level 9. He had been able to kill the imp, but he knew that this monster was beyond him, stat bonuses or no stat bonuses. The only thing he could do now was run. And with 19 points in dexterity, he could run quite quickly. However, the Ash Prowler was built for speed, and it was rapidly gaining on him. Even worse, his passing stirred up other monsters, and soon he had a long train of pursuers. His breaths came in short gasps as his stamina began to bottom out, and he made it to a ruin just as it hit zero. Jonathan stumbled through the door, his strength suddenly gone. He lay there, paralyzed, as his stamina slowly came back to him, wondering why the monsters weren't ripping into him. He slowly got to his feet, and noticed that the creatures were running off into the distance. Yeah, you better run. Mangy mutts, Jonathan crowed as he saw them retreating. The fetid, warm breath on his back was the only indication of why they had run. A moment later, he was flying through the air, his left arm broken. Behind him, a twisted pile of flesh slid across the ground, one massive, warped arm dragging behind it. It was that arm that had struck Jonathan so brutally. The only other identifying feature on the monster was a gaping maw that was half as wide as he was tall. Jonathan didn't bother analyzing it. He already knew just how strong the thing was. Jonathan scrambled backwards, feeling the agony of his multiple broken bones as he did so. The bones in his hand had been crushed to powder, and it was completely unusable. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping him going at this point, that and the desire not to die. He had no wish to be devoured by the hideous creature in front of him. The one good thing about his predicament was that the emergence of the monster had scared off all of the other creatures on the ash, leaving it to deal with Jonathan in peace. He spotted a warped bar of iron on the ground nearby, which seemed to have fallen off a crenellation on a nearby building. The end was pointed, and it was the closest thing to a weapon that he could see. Jonathan scrambled over to it and picked it up with his good hand, clenching his fist tightly around it. Unsteadily rising to his feet, he stared his assailant down, his entire body burning with pain. He managed to stand tall through it, however, and he advanced slowly. A burning rage was rising up within him, eclipsing his common sense. He could probably outrun this creature, slow as it was, but he wanted to make it pay for what it had done to him. In addition, he craved the power that he had felt after killing the imp. If that meager creature had given him such pleasure, then what would this far stronger beast do? No, his best option was to kill it here and now. Jonathan leaped forwards and stabbed out with his weapon, lancing into the rubbery hide of the hideous monster. It rumbled in displeasure and whipped its gargantuan arm around, allowing him to see its putrescent flesh. Odious boils and pustules lined its arm, and its flesh was welted and infected. All in all, it was a uniquely disgusting creature. Jonathan ducked under the strike, glad that his enhanced stats were allowing him to keep up somewhat. The monster in front of him might have been slow, but it was far stronger than him. If he took one more hit from that thing, then it would be all over. He lashed out with his weapon once more, scoring a line across the air. Some of the blisters popped, showering the ground with pus. The ground sizzled where it landed, and Jonathan gulped, his apprehension briefly working past his battle frenzy. Not only could the thing tear him apart with its brute strength, but it could also kill him with its blood. He would have to be even more careful than he had thought. Still, the thought of retreat did not enter his mind even once. Something had changed within him, whether upon entering the world, or from dealing with the agony of his hellish descent. He was not the same mild-mannered truck driver as before. He was something different. Something dangerous. Jonathan shot his hand forwards once more, spearing into the monster's copious gut. It chortled, a long, burbling sound, and then sucked in its flesh, wrenching the weapon out of Jonathan's grip. He stumbled backwards, narrowly avoiding another strike from the massive arm. Some of the blood landed on his bare flesh as its arm swung, and he hissed as it burnt through his flesh. The iron rod was buried deep in its stomach, and fluid dripped out of the open wound. If he could tear that out of its flesh, he could severely injure the creature. The only problem was getting there. At this point, he was in too deep to retreat. Even if he survived, the next monster would kill him in his current state. He needed desperately to level up, and heal. Hopefully the healing effect would be enough. Somewhere within him, a fraction of the old Jonathan Harlow was screaming in abject terror, but he buried that pitiful creature down as far as he could. That would not serve him now. He ran forwards, ducking under a ponderous blow, and seized the end of the iron rod with his hand. Planting his feet, Jonathan yanked on it as hard as he could. There was a wet tearing noise, and the bar came free, sending a torrent of fluid over the ground in Jonathan's hand. He screamed in agony as his flesh sizzled away, but the noise that the monster made distracted him from it. It was already dead, and it just didn't know it yet. That did not mean it wasn't dangerous though. Before Jonathan could even blink, a red light erupted from the beast, and it swung its singular arm at far higher speeds than before, sending it hurtling towards his head. There was no dodging that strike, no matter what he did. Jonathan got his hands up in a futile gesture, and he screamed in defiance. A golden light erupted out of him, and his hands pulsed with power. Suddenly, he knew what to do. Seizing the monster with a strength beyond anything he had felt before, he wrenched off its arm, sending a welter of foul fluid everywhere. The creature wailed, and slumped to the ground. Something within him cracked, and he spat up blood before collapsing backwards, completely spent. Jonathan woke to the sound of snuffling coming from next to his ear. He cracked open one eyelid, seeing another of the ash prowlers nosing at his hair. It obviously thought that he was dead, with the lack of caution that it was exhibiting. Jonathan rolled over and punched it full force, eliciting a yelp from the creature. It bared its fangs, but something in Jonathan's eyes caused it to back down. With a whimper, it backed off and fled. Jonathan had a host of notifications waiting for him, and he quickly opened them after seeing that he was in no further danger. You have killed a fetid ooze. You have leveled up. X3. The trio of levels had healed his body almost to perfect condition, but his left arm still felt tender. Still, it was better than nothing. There was another notification too, one that seemed more urgent somehow. He opened it without any hesitation, curious about what it had to offer. You have gained a new skill. Smite, Legendary. Use your inner divinity to imbue your body with your godly power, increasing your power by a significant amount. However, this has an immense toll on your body. That must have been what he had used against the fetid ooze, whatever had created the golden light. It was an incredibly powerful skill, but not one without drawbacks it seemed. Also, it told him how he was supposed to gain skills here. Clearly, there were no handouts. It had to be something that he had created himself. Jonathan got to his feet and dusted himself off, reveling in his newfound power. Those levels had created a cumulative effect with his stat multiplier, meaning that he had gained a larger number of stat points than he would have otherwise. Rather than gaining 6 points to each stat, he had gained 8. It was only 2 more points, but he knew that he was beyond the realm of human capability at this point. If he had to guess, 10 was the average, and 20 was the upper limit. He was like a real-life superhero now, albeit quite a pathetic one. There was one more message as well waiting after that one. You have gained a new title. Underdog, Rare. You took out a monster over 10 levels higher than you. That is quite an impressive achievement, albeit not one that is especially so. This title can be upgraded. Bonuses, plus 5 points to strength. It was a decent boost, with his stat boost making it even more so. In addition, it revealed a bit more about how titles worked. They seemed to follow the classic rarity scheme from games back on Earth, with a few outliers like his celestial rarity title. In any case, it was likely that only titles above a certain rarity would give multiplicative bonuses, rather than a one-time boost. Still, any boost to power was always welcome. He closed his notifications and took stock of his more physical changes. His muscles were all toned now, and clearly defined. In addition, his mind felt clearer than it had ever felt before. Who knew that going to hell would feel so good? Clearly, this version of hell was different from the one back on Earth. There certainly were damned souls, being punished for their sins, but there seemed to be an actual world down here, populated with monsters. Were there any sapient beings here as well, or was it just an endless land of beasts? Well, the few levels that he had eked out were the start of his journey back to wherever he had come from. He had no idea how to get out of this place, but he would certainly try. As he thought that, a chime interrupted him. It seems that you have run into a spot of trouble. If you are receiving this message, either you have been imprisoned, possessed, or sent to the infinite hells. I sincerely hope that it was not the last one. If so, hopefully this can help. Sarnathros. It was another message from his mysterious patron, promising aid. Jonathan wasn't sure what to think about the man, or god he supposed, that had brought him here. On one hand, he had been wrenched away from his life, while on the other, he felt better than he had ever felt before. Another prompt opened up on his interface, and he read it. You have gained a quest. Hellbreaker, impossible. You have been imprisoned in the infinite hells, a world that certainly lives up to its name. However, there is a way out, if not one that anyone has ever reached before. You must descend through the circles of hell, and kill each one's guardian to progress. Finally, you must reach the very center and kill the devil himself. This, however, is a long road, one that will take an eon. That is, of course, if you do not die along the way. Current objective, defeat Granath, overseer of the ash heaps. Rewards, Tier 2 weapon, armor or miscellaneous item. Ultimate objective, defeat Angranor, the Lord of Hell. Rewards, freedom. Jonathan read, and reread the quest. As shown by its name, it indeed seemed impossible. Still, it was his only source of hope, and as he read it, a fierce conviction arose within him. He had a purpose now, and he would fulfill it if it was the last thing he would do. He closed the quest and took a deep breath before taking stock of his surroundings. He was in the middle of what looked to be some sort of temple, with a large altar at the end of the halfway. Most of it was in ruins, with rubble littering the floor, but a large portion of it was still intact, mainly the wall area. Jonathan idly wondered whether it had always been like this, or whether there had once been a civilization there. Judging by the nature of the hells, the former was more likely. He knew almost nothing about the world that he had been summoned into, a problem that he wanted to rectify. Unfortunately, there was no apparent way to do so. Instead, he would have to blindly follow his quest. There were no other monsters nearby, and Jonathan decided to take the opportunity to study the ways in which his body had been changed. He picked up a rock from the ground nearby, and marveled at how light it felt. Throwing it with his full power, it slammed into the wall, chipping it. The rock itself shattered into a dozen pieces. More importantly, however, was the thing that he had no opportunity to test as of yet. Mana. It was there on his stat sheet, and he knew what it was probably for, the casting of magic, but he did not have any spells, nor the knowledge of how to use them. However, there was something within him that was new. A tiny ball of glowing blue energy hovered in the center of his body, and he found that if he split his focus between it and the outside world, he could keep track of both at the same time. Moving his mind's eye closer to the core, he saw that it was built like a miniature sun, with whirls and loops of power dancing across its surface. However, the actual orb itself was perfectly smooth. Within it was a portion of a viscous gas that he assumed was his mana. Jonathan idly reached out and touched the sphere. A tiny bit of the mana concentrated around where his fingers had made contact, and he felt a brief moment of connection to it. Using that moment of connection, he seized the mana in his hand and tried to force it into the outside world. Jonathan let out a yelp as his hand reddened. However, a tiny flame appeared above it, colored a bright blue. The only problem was that it was hurting him at the same time. Jonathan banished the flame, and was met with a notification. You have gained a pathway skill. Mana Manipulation, Novice 1. Mana manipulation is one of the most basic skills in the universe, and you have shown a strange aptitude for it. This skill influences your ease of manipulating the mana within your body, and gives bonuses as you progress, like all pathway skills. Jonathan frowned as he read the message. Pathway skill? The hell is that? He said out loud. In response, another message appeared in front of him. Pathway skills are skills that are too broad in scope to be contained within one singular aspect. Instead, you master aspects of it, gaining greater power and experience as you progress through the ranks. The ranks are as follows: novice, student, apprentice, journeyman, expert, master, grandmaster, sage, saint, avatar, incarnate, primarch and divinity. These ranks are based on the amount of knowledge that you hold based on the skill, with novice having a tiny fraction, and divinity having everything. Each rank will give an increasingly larger stat bonus. It was structured like an apprenticeship system back on Earth. During the medieval times, Jonathan knew that the ranks were similar to that, and he wondered why it was so closely related. Of course, based on his experiences with the runic language's translation, everything was simply being translated into something that he would understand. In any case, power was power, and knowledge was knowledge. Jonathan peeked out of the building, and noting that there were no monsters in sight, went back to mana manipulation. It seemed like a vital skill for his survival, and he wanted to gain those stat bonuses that had been mentioned. About an hour later, Jonathan only had a blistered hand to show for his efforts. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He had increased the size of the flame, but seeing as his tests of it had shown that its heat was not enough to actually burn anything except for him, it was useless. He sighed, and banished the flame for the last time, nursing his burnt hand. He had discovered that he had a slightly increased healing rate, and he knew that he was powerful enough for the damage to not be an issue, except in terms of pain. Pain he could deal with. A bit annoyed, Jonathan returned to his core, and repeated the process one more time, trying to see what he was doing wrong. As he saw the mana move, he had an epiphany. All he was doing was summoning the mana to the outside world. He wasn't actually controlling it. This time, he held a clear image of a contained ball of power in his mind as he summoned the energy to the real world. This time, there was no burning sensation, only a ball of energy hovering over his palm. His interface chimed, and he saw that he had ranked up. Mana manipulation has reached Novice 2. He immediately felt a tiny increase in his ability to use his mana, and he seized control of the orb with his mind, struck by a sudden insight. Compressing it with his willpower, he watched as the ball shrunk down to about a quarter of its size. Jonathan held it to the floor, and watched in satisfaction as a small amount of stone melted. It was a long way from a weapon, but it was a start. He rose to his feet, and left the ruin, entering the ash heaps once more. There was nothing left for him there, and he needed to find a way towards Granath, wherever he, or she, was. Some time later, another one of the ash prowlers appeared on the horizon, and this time Jonathan started making a beeline towards it. He was hungry to test out his new stats, especially with his bonus from his title. In addition, he had an idea about what to do with the extra stat points that he gained from leveling. The way that his stat multiplier worked was based on quantity, and the more points that he put into a stat at once, the greater the impact. Of course, he could not afford to do such a thing for too long, especially in a place like this, but he could hold out another level at least. As he loped towards the wolf, he opened his stat sheet again. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Basic. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 5. 9 free points. Strength. 36. Dexterity. 30. Constitution. 29. Resilience. 29. Intelligence. 26. Wisdom. 24. Divinity. 1. Health 290/290. Stamina 360/360. Mana 260/260. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, Unique. Nascent Divinity, Celestial. Underdog, Rare. Skills. Smite, Legendary. Identify, Common. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Novice 2. Quests. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Jonathan had seen some huge increases, with his stats having almost doubled from before, and in the case of strength and dexterity, actually doubling. No wonder he felt like he was on top of the world. He had a sneaking suspicion that most people in the universe did not have such a rapid growth rate as himself, although most of them were not in hell either. Those two things kind of balanced each other out. The prowler was almost upon him, and Jonathan balled his fists, ready to fight. The battle began with a snap of the monster's jaws, directed at his left foot. The creature was trying to hamstring him, but Jonathan was too fast for it. He snapped out his right foot, and caught the monster under the chin, stunning it. With his other foot, he punted the monster off its feet, staggering it. Rushing forwards, he began to lay into it with his hands and feet, battering the creature into submission. He might have felt some sympathy for the creature before, but his new worldview, as well as the appearance of the monster, had removed all empathy for it. It was merely something to be killed. He was too powerful for it to deal with now, and as it lay there, dying, he decided to finish it off with his new skill. Perhaps that would further his understanding a bit. Summoning the ball of concentrated energy to his hand, Jonathan thrust it into the monster's head. Flesh bubbled and melted around it, and it boiled the creature's brain, killing it utterly. It was a gruesome way to die, and not a very efficient one either, seeing as he had to maintain contact for upwards of a half-minute to kill it completely. However, he felt as if his ranking had gone up a little bit, so it had been worth it in the end. He withdrew from the creature's steaming corpse, and resumed his trek towards an unknown destination. If he just kept walking, eventually he would have to find something. As it turned out, something found him first. A pack of ash prowlers emerged from behind one of the many ruins some time later, snarling at him. He still had the blood of their kin on his hands, so he supposed they were justified. However, all he saw was a free level, and a means to test himself. A single prowler had been trivial, but what about 5? Could he keep up with them then? Despite their higher level, he was more than a match for them individually, and his stats were likely higher than theirs. Come on then, you mangy pieces of shit. Come and taste my fist. It was a bit cliché, but he had been sent to hell. Some melodramatic one-liners were certainly in order. The insult incensed the monsters, and they charged in unison, barking and baying like hounds on the hunt. Only, Jonathan was the hunter here. He ducked around the strike of one of the monsters, only to be caught by another one. Its teeth sunk into his shin, and struck bone. Jonathan shouted in anger, and pummeled the beast with his fist until it let go, bloodied and dazed. However, by that time, the others had surrounded him. This would be a harder fight than he had expected. Jonathan leaped a meter up into the air, his muscles propelling him at a greater speed than he had expected. As far as he could tell, the progression of his stats were quite linear, and he estimated his strength at a bit over 3 times his previous state. As he leaped, the monsters aborted their attacks, waiting until he landed. That would prove to be a mistake. Jonathan crashed down with twin balls of mana in his hands, sending them plunging deep into the skulls of 2 monsters. His momentum enabled the balls of power to sink deeper than they would normally, and they killed the monsters instantly. Perhaps his mana was useful after all. Energy entered him, but it was not enough to bring another level. He had a suspicion that it would only get harder to level from here. Blood splattered the ground, thick, black ichor that looked almost like molasses, causing the remaining 3 prowlers to growl warily. The one that he had injured earlier yelped and turned tail, fleeing from Jonathan. As one of the prowlers looked back, Jonathan pounced, bringing his fist down on its spine. Something cracked within it, and the beast fell to the ground. Behind him, the remaining one sunk its teeth into his back, but Jonathan ignored it, instead killing the beast in front of him with another blow. Whirling around, he punched the prowler as hard as he could, sending it back a few paces. With a devastating front kick, it collapsed, dead. Enough energy entered him to send him up another level, and his wounds healed over. With a smile, he contemplated his options for upgrades. With his newfound talent for mana manipulation, he wanted to invest a bit into intelligence and wisdom, which both impacted the resource. He had discovered, through trial and error, that wisdom impacted the regeneration rate of mana. Adding stats to both would increase the amount that he had to play with. His strength was far enough ahead that he didn't need to add any more. With that in mind, he placed 6 points into wisdom and intelligence, bringing them up to 32 and 34 respectively. Jonathan closed his status screen and looked around him, noting that there was a strange light in the distance. Could that be what he was looking for, civilization? In any case, it was better than wandering around the ash heaps until he died of hunger and thirst. On that topic, he had not eaten or drunk in the better part of a day, not counting the time he had spent during his descent, and his mouth was parched. Now that he noticed it, however, it became far worse. Jonathan began walking, ignoring the gritty ash beneath his feet and the desolate landscape around him. If he focused on his predicament, he would only be discouraged. Instead, he concentrated on his mana core, trying to eke out as much knowledge from it as he could. He was slowly becoming addicted to his mana manipulation skill, and it was the closest thing to real magic that he had access to. In fact, it was so addicting, that he lost himself in it fully, leaving himself open to an attack. A dull and muted thump on his left leg barely startled him out of his fugue, and it was only because of the warm liquid that he felt running down it that he snapped out of his meditation. There was a filthy, rat-like monster gnawing at his leg, tearing off great strips of flesh with each flash of its curved incisions. The thing was about 2 or 3 times larger than a rat from Earth, and it had 2 curved horns that extended up past its head. Jonathan howled in pain and shook his foot desperately, trying to dislodge the creature. This was to no avail, however, and it held on fast. Jonathan gritted his teeth, and pushed his mana through his leg, sending a burst of blue fire out of the skin. It burned his leg severely, but it also cauterized his wound, and injured the rat at the same time. Overall, a win. The rat fell backwards, smoking lightly, and Jonathan reached down, snapping its neck. The amount of energy that he got from it was beyond pitiful, but any bit helped. He didn't even bother reading the notification that formed on its death. He did not care what the creature's name was. In the grip of an intense hunger, he briefly eyed up the corpse, wondering if it was edible. The oozing yellow liquid that he saw spurting out of the rat as it died caused him to abandon that course of action. He might have relinquished most of his old-world morals, but just because he had gone almost entirely wild, it didn't mean that he had to eat like a wild man either. No, he was better than that. Whatever was at that beacon in the distance, it would be salvation. That was the mantra that he kept playing in his head as he wandered, and before long, he was drifting along, lost in a stupor of energy deprivation. He wandered across the ash for some time, unaware of his surroundings. Many of the rat creatures tried to attack him, but he fended them off unconsciously, his skin blazing with bright light as they came close. As he wandered, his mastery of his mana slowly increased, and he eventually ranked it up to the next tier of novice rank. He was barely aware of that, only recognizing it briefly. Instead, he just kept on walking, and walking, and walking. Over the next day, he slowly became weaker and weaker until he could barely put one foot in front of another. Each time that he came close to failing, however, he was reminded of his purpose by the blinking quest in his interface, the one telling him that he would break hell. That, and nothing else, was what kept him going in the face of disaster. Finally, he collapsed, unable to continue any longer. His tongue was like a length of sandpaper, and his skin was dried up from the heat of the air around him. Even though his mind and will could keep going, his body couldn't keep up. With that, he drifted into an uneasy slumber, nestled up against one of the ash drifts. Jonathan awoke to the sound of bells ringing, and he gagged as something forced liquid down his throat. When he realized that liquid was water, albeit water that was quite unclean, he sucked at it desperately, drawing the liquid into his system. He drank too quickly, however, and he sputtered as the water went down the wrong way. Someone near him laughed, and he slowly opened his eyes, blinking in the light. He was lying on a table in a large room that looked suspiciously like a tavern. A few lanterns cast the place, and its patrons, in a dim light, creating large, moving shadows on the wall as the people drank from large tankards. Hovering over him was a human, or at least it looked like a human at first glance. However, when the creature moved into the light, it clearly was not. It had reptilian skin, and a mass of scar tissue over its left eye. However, the way that it moved told Jonathan that it was feminine in nature. He tried to raise his head, but he was too weak for that, instead groaning as pain ripped through his spine. "Easy there, wanderer. You don't want to undo all my hard work, now do you?" The woman's voice was soft and raspy, and there was a faint note of humor in it. Where am I?" Jonathan asked, his mouth wet enough to talk, although with some pain. "You're in Dreg, one of the many towns of the ash heaps. But you already knew that, didn't you? Unless you aren't from here." The woman leaned in, baring long fangs. "We aren't like the demons and monsters here, but we aren't saints either. Tell me, do you have anything valuable on you?" "What?" "No, I don't," Jonathan replied truthfully. All he had was his tattered clothes, and his life. The woman sniffed at him, but evidently sensed that he was telling the truth, as she withdrew her head. "Very well. I believe you. However, you cannot stay here. We barely have enough food and drink to support our population, let alone feed another wayward soul. Dreg was never meant to be anything more than a homestead." "A homestead? Why would someone build one in the middle of hell?" Jonathan wondered. The woman's face darkened in response. "Do you think it was our choice, my choice, to live in a place like this? No, we were the souls of the damned that resisted the pain of the descent, and managed to come out the other side with our minds intact. We were all marked by that passage, however. I assume you know what I am talking about." "I do. I remember that falling sensation, the hideous pain." Jonathan trailed off, his mind lost in the horrors of what he had gone through. The woman sighed and patted his arm gingerly, as if unsure of the impact it would have. "Don't be afraid. You avoided a far worse fate. Those ash imps would have carried you off to Granath. He would have done far worse things to you than a bit of pain. You see all those monsters on the way here? Well, those all used to be damned souls. Jonathan stiffened at the mention of Granath, his current target. Granath? He asked, hoping to get more out of the woman. Who's that? You don't know? Oh, right, you're new here. Each circle of hell has a guardian, and the one for the ash heaps is Granath. He is a massive worm the length of a city block that feasts on the twisted souls of those who come here. He is monstrously powerful, at the top of Tier 2. Nobody can hope to stand against him. The soul of some hero came here a few decades back, and tried to kill Granath. We could hear his screams from here as he was tortured into oblivion. Yet again, Jonathan was hearing about the power system in this world. How powerful is the top of Tier 2? He asked, trying as hard as he could not to sound suspicious. The woman frowned. Were you some sort of fool in your past life? Did you never reach any sort of power level beyond level 1? Is that why you are so ignorant? Something like that. Well, I'll give you a brief overview. Each tier has 100 levels, and they all give more power than the last. Compared to us, a being like Granath is like a god. And there are more tiers after Tier 2, but I have only heard about them in myths. In any case, Granath could destroy a city in a matter of minutes, and not a small one either. To think that he is the weakest of the guardians. Well, that sounds like trouble. Other than the hero, has anyone else tried to kill him? Did anyone ever get close to succeeding? What are all these questions about? Don't tell me you want to kill him. Are you chasing the myth of the Hellbreaker? The woman asked, snorting in disdain. Jonathan looked at her, having heard the name of his quest. Hellbreaker? What do you know about the Hellbreaker? So you are. What a fool you are. You should try to eke out as best an existence as you can here, rather than chasing ghosts. As to what it is, I assume that we all heard the same myths. The hero, destined to conquer the infinite hells and free the damned. Yeah, we all daydream about being the Hellbreaker, but we already knew that it is an impossible task. If Granath is impossible to defeat, then the Lord of Hell himself is beyond the reach of all. The woman paused and then gasped as a burly man shoved her aside. He was of a different race, with green skin and long tusks. If anything, Jonathan would have said that he was an orc. Curious, he analyzed the man. Jorg. Half-orc. Level 12. The man was of a higher level than him, and the look of brutish cunning in his eyes was not encouraging to Jonathan. Well. Another foundling, brought in by Kyra. All I see in front of me is a sack of essence. The tone that the man was taking told Jonathan that he was probably about to be murdered, in full sight of everyone in the tavern. He looked around for help, but everyone studiously ignored him. Jorg reached down with one massive hand, and grabbed at Jonathan's throat. Jonathan snapped his head to the side and rose up as quickly as he could, summoning mana to his hands. Jorg narrowed his eyes at this. So you have a bit of a bite to you after all. Good. The system will reward me more for this then. Jonathan ignored the man's words and got ready to fight for his life. Jorg's hands glowed with red light and the man sped forwards, moving far faster than he had any right to do. Only Jonathan's instincts, honed from his previous battles, allowed him to duck in time. The blow clipped his shoulder instead of his head, and he was sent stumbling back, with a crack in his collarbone. Jorg laughed bitterly, and attacked again. This time, Jonathan counterattacked. Moving the ball of mana to the front of his fist, he punched as Jorg's fist came in. To win this thing, he would need to take a bit of damage in return. Jonathan suddenly realized that he had no apprehension about killing the man in front of him. He had been attacked first, and it was within his right to kill the brutish half-orc that was so willing to murder innocents for a simple level up. As Jonathan's fist connected, Jorg drove his own fist into Jonathan's stomach, rupturing something there. Jonathan spat up blood, but maintained his course, driving the coruscating ball of power into Jorg's chin. The ball of mana ate through the flesh and bone, turning it to molten slag. Jorg howled in pain, a noise that quickly turned into a whimper as his tongue melted. Jorg staggered backwards, and Jonathan followed up with another strike, straight into his face. With a rattling cry, Jorg died, his skull cracking beneath the power of the raw mana. Everyone in the tavern went silent, staring at Jonathan in amazement. He wiped off his fist, trying not to let the pain on his face show. Jorg had ruptured some organ in his abdomen, and his only hope was a level up. Power left Jorg's body and drifted over to Jonathan, filling him with enough power to give him 2 levels. As the stat points settled into his body, he took a deep breath of pleasure, watching as his wounds healed over. Without a further word, he walked out of the tavern. Even if he had been in the right, he doubted that these people would want someone like him staying around. As he took in the tiny town, barely 10 huts and the tavern, the reptilian woman, Kyra, rushed out of the tavern behind him. "Wait! How are you so strong for your level?" she asked. "Because," Jonathan began, preparing to say something rash, "I am the Hellbreaker." Without hesitation, he began turning, leaving the woman behind him. He had a demonic worm to kill, and a tier to climb. 2 hours later, Jonathan was regretting not picking up any food or water from Dreg. Then again, it had been unlikely that any of the people would have given him any, after what he had done to Jorg. Besides, the water that Kyra had given him filled the hole within him enough. His higher stats were starting to have a noticeable impact on his hunger and thirst, and he had not had to use the bathroom since arriving here. A blinking notification that he had chosen to ignore waited for him, and by the way that it appeared, he knew that it was a title. He also knew what the title was for. Finally, he resigned himself to opening it. "You have gained a new title. Righteous Killer, Rare. You have slain another sapient being, although with just cause. Continue to convince yourself that you are not just another murderer, and you will keep the demons at bay. Rewards, +2 to resilience, +2 to wisdom." It was a strange distribution of stats, but it was still stats nonetheless, and Jonathan wasn't going to disparage them, no matter how unsavory his means of acquisition were. To survive in this place, he would need every edge that he could get. If that meant slaying marauding orcs, so be it. He closed the notification and studied the land ahead of him. The ash drifts were starting to become larger, and the landscape was no longer so monotonous. He could see 2 lights in the distance, likely the site of other towns. The fact that one of them looked larger than the one piqued his interest if nothing else. He needed to find out more about the world that he was in, and now that he knew about the existence of sapient beings within this place, he needed to seek them out. However, judging by the brightness of the light, it was quite a ways away. That was just as well, as Jonathan had no wish to be assaulted by another person again without the means with which to defend himself. He was already nearly the same level as the Ash Prowlers, and many times more powerful too, and he wanted to at least reach level 10 by the time that he got to the city. However, the knowledge of how many levels were left until he could even match Granath, the monster he was supposed to kill, was staggering. At this rate, assuming that leveling got harder and harder as time went on, he could be in this one circle of hell for years, if not decades. That was assuming that he could even find Granath in the first place. Still, the same fire burned within him that had been kindled by thoughts of revenge, and he knew that he would never willingly give up on his quest. He would climb the mountain in front of him, and all the mountains past that as well. The only thing left to do was continue to study his pathway skill as much as he could. Only this time, he would try not to get lost in it. Splitting his focus between his whirling core and the ashy wastes around him, Jonathan began his trek towards civilization, or at least a small town where he could get some food and information. As he walked, he sunk into a trance-like state, but not one that was too deep for him to keep track of the outside world. Instead, his core was superimposed over his vision, allowing him to manipulate it as he walked. Jonathan wasn't sure whether this was the effect of his advanced intelligence, but he was able to concentrate and split his focus far more easily than ever before, allowing him to make headway in a manner that would have been impossible to him before he had come to this world. After a few hours, the chime of another notification alerted him to the fact that he had reached novice rank 4 in his mana manipulation skill. Now that he had made some headway, it was time to see if he could do anything more than just creating balls of energy with which to fight. It was probably a long shot, but he had a craving for some sort of ranged skill to allow him to avoid at least a part of the pain of melee fighting. However, he was interrupted by a baying howl from the distance, calling across the ash. Jonathan removed his mind's eye from his core and got ready for a fight. What came padding around the corner of a ruined cathedral, however, was not any mere ash prowler. This one was clearly of the same pattern, but it was double the size, and liquid flame dripped from its jaws. He scanned the beast, finding out that it was a new type of monster, and with a new designation as well. Alpha Ash Prowler, Elite. Level 17. It was an elite tier monster, meaning that it was more powerful than its brethren, probably in every way. In addition, it was the highest level thing that Jonathan had ever faced. Perhaps it was now time for him to run. He might have been hungry for more power, but he had no wish to die in a futile fight. With a sudden grunt, he was off. The baying howl returned, and he looked around just in time to see the alpha prowler leaping for him, moving far faster than he was. He ducked under its strike, and watched as it landed gracefully in front of him. The creature was far too fast for him to escape. Instead, he would have to make a stand here and now, despite the fact that he was drastically underleveled. He would have been confident had this been a normal ash prowler, but the elite designation was giving him pause. If this was anything like a video game, and all things pointed to it being so, then this monster likely had more power than a normal one of its kind at that level. It was similar to him in many ways, having greater power than its level indicated. However, it had 10 levels on him as well. He growled at the creature, trying to intimidate it. Of course, his efforts were met without response, and the monster began to charge once more. Fire built in the back of its throat, and it disgorged a large blob of liquid heat towards Jonathan. His eyes widened, and he leaped to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. Then the beast took him full in the face with its claws and he went down. A memory from Earth suddenly surfaced, of the year-long stint he had spent studying martial arts. It had been recommended to him by his boss, in case of any would-be truck robbers. With a grunt, he gripped the creature's paws with both hands and flipped it over his shoulder, using its momentum against it. The monster landed heavily on the ash, and he quickly hyperextended its paw. Of course, the range of motion for this monster was different to the humans on which Jonathan had trained, but enough force applied to a body part would get the job done regardless. And with 4 times the strength of a normal human, Jonathan could bring some serious force to the table. The bone snapped audibly, and the monster roared in pain, readying another fireball in its mouth. If Jonathan stayed in this position, it would be impossible to avoid. Instead, he withdrew quickly, narrowly missing the glob of fire that seared past his head. He didn't know what would happen if that attack hit him, and he didn't want to find out either. He came in for another pass, and grappled with the monster, trying to overpower it. He had underestimated its strength, however, and it quickly had him on the back foot, tearing at his skin with its claws and jaws. As blood ran down his front, Jonathan winced. He really needed to get some armor before long. He quickly summoned his energy balls to his hands, and pumped more energy into them than he had ever done before. The balls started to unravel and come apart, and he had the distinct feeling that they would detonate soon if he did not use them. That was actually quite useful in this situation. He waited for an opening and then thrust his hands into the prowler's mouth. Before it could bite down, he sent more mana into the balls, causing them to destabilize. The flesh was flayed off his bones, and the prowler's head exploded. Jonathan screamed as the flesh melted from his hands, exposing the open bones to the air. However, as the energy from the monster entered him, the wound started to heal over. There was still some residual scarring, as a level up could only achieve so much, but it had been enough. Even better, he had leveled up multiple times. He knew that he would not have gained as much energy, or essence as the orc had called it, had the monster not been an elite. Opening his notifications, he saw that there was more than one waiting for him. Firstly, however, was his level ups. You have killed an alpha ash prowler. You have leveled up x3. Those levels had allowed him to reach level 10, which had been his goal. Far from just having achieved that though, he realized that he had gained more than he had bargained for when he read the next notification. For reaching level 10, you have unlocked boons. Available Tier 1 boons. Tough skin. Elastic muscles. Speedy nerves. Inner conscience. There was no further explanation than this, but Jonathan could tell what the boons did by their descriptions. The first one obviously increased his defense, the second allowed him to move more quickly, the third increased his reaction time, whereas the fourth was a bit more mysterious. He immediately ruled it out, however, knowing that he could not waste such a valuable opportunity on something that he was utterly ignorant of. Also, he didn't really care for the middle two options either. Neither would help him in this situation amply. That only left him with the tough skin option, which fitted his current fighting style. He was certainly taking enough damage as it was. He quickly selected the first option, and doubled over as pain ripped through his skin. It cracked and reformed over and over again, becoming dense and leathery. Soon he was left with a bulwark of flesh that guarded his inner organs against the outer world. He looked a lot more weather-beaten than before, with cracks spreading across his flesh, but he was satisfied with the power that he felt. Idly, he punched a nearby wall, feeling a muted pain rather than the sharp one he would have felt before. If nothing else, this would make his punches more effective. More importantly, he had a new pathway skill waiting for him, and this one was already somewhat upgraded. You have gained a pathway skill. Martial Arts Student 3. You have dabbled in the ways of material prowess in a past life, and some of that wisdom still remains within you. Your expertise is crude and basic at best, but it is a sturdy foundation for greater heights in the future. +3 to strength, +2 to dexterity. You have access to a martial skill. Redirect, uncommon. Use your opponent's momentum against them by unbalancing them. Accept. Y/N. Jonathan quickly accepted the skill, and felt a wealth of information enter his brain. Suddenly he was far more adept at the technique that he had used against the Alpha Prowler earlier. It was as if it had been downloaded into his brain. Also, the stat bonus from the pathway skill was quite useful as well. Opening up his stat sheet, Jonathan saw that he had quite a few points to allocate as well. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Basic. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 11. 18 free points. Strength. 53. Dexterity. 46. Constitution. 42. Resilience. 42. Intelligence. 39. Wisdom. 37. Divinity. 1. Health 420/420. Stamina 530/530. Mana 390/390. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, unique. Nascent Divinity, celestial. Righteous Killer, rare. Underdog, rare. Skills. Smite, legendary. Redirect, uncommon. Identify, common. Pathway skills. Martial Arts, Student 3. Mana Manipulation, Novice 4. Quests. Hellbreaker, impossible. Jonathan's stat sheet was starting to get a bit long, which was a good thing. It meant that he was growing more powerful. In addition, his titles were starting to expand, and if he got a few more, he would definitely be a step ahead of the curve. He looked over his stats with a strange sense of pride for a few minutes before closing the sheet and continuing on his way. Jonathan had misjudged the distance earlier, for it took him days to reach the next village. During that time he had been assaulted by all manner of monsters, and had even had to battle another one of the fetid oozes. This time around he was far better equipped to defeat it however, and he had gained another 2 levels in that time. As he went, he made sure to judge his relative strength, wanting to save his free stat points as long as he could. He had initially thought that it would be impossible to progress without them, but as time went on, he learned just how much stronger than normal he was. He was gaining 12 stat points per level, not counting the free ones, and that was 3 times more than the bonuses that he had seen for the other class options in the Onyx Citadel. He was on the road to true power, and he salivated at the thought of dumping 50, or even 100 points into a stat in the near future. This hunger should have disturbed him, but even the realization that he was addicted to the thrill of leveling did not dissuade him. Gaining power could only ever be a good thing, right? By the time that he reached the village he had been aiming for, he had also increased his mana manipulation to novice rank 6. Progression within the initial rank of the pathway skill was ridiculously easy, although it was more a matter of experimentation than actual mastery. He knew that it would only get harder from there on. If not for the fact that the system, as Jorg had called it, extended into the infinite hells, whether by accident or design, he would have died 100 times over by now. Even if the monsters had been unleveled, they were still monsters. It was the only spark of hope in the dark world that Jonathan lived in, that and the hope of revenge. As he crested a hillock of ash, tainted with the bones of monsters, he finally caught sight of his destination. A modestly sized town stretched out beneath him, surrounded by a wall of dark stone. It was a drab place, with nondescript buildings made out of the same dark rock as the walls. The few people that Jonathan could see were all somber in appearance, and were dressed in battered leathers from some unknown source. He made his way down the side of the hill, making sure not to slip on the inhuman bones, and eventually reached the base of the hillock, on level ground with the town. It was large enough to house perhaps a few hundred people, and 2 depressed-looking guards stood watch at a gate. Jonathan quickly scanned them, finding out that they were both level 15, 3 levels above him. If it came to a fight however, he was confident that he could take them. Jonathan cautiously walked up to the 2 guards, approaching slowly. As he crossed the ash, they looked up and stood to attention. "Halt! Who are you? Why are you here?" One of the guards, a woman, asked, her voice tense. "I'm just a traveler, looking for succor. Surely your city does not turn away those in need?" Jonathan said, trying to sound as pathetic as possible. "Just a traveler, my ass," the other guard said, his voice deep. "You're level 12. People don't get there unless they seek out fights. I will ask you now, what is your business here?" "Like I said, I am looking for food, water, and lodging. Perhaps some equipment as well. Do you even have money?" The female guard interjected. "We're not going to let in some wastrel who cannot contribute to our town." "Money? What kind of money?" This was the first time Jonathan had heard of there being money in this place. "Leviathan marks, what else?" The woman replied, pulling out a dark coin from her pocket. On it was a strange, tentacled creature. "Oh. Well, I am afraid that I am lacking in that department. But," Jonathan quickly said, as the guard seemed to lose interest, "I am quite handy in a fight. If there are any monsters that you need me to kill, I will do it." "Handy in a fight," he says, the male guard snorted. "All right, I'll give you a chance. There is a nest of waste goblins nearby. Bring me the broodmother's head, and I will let you in. Might as well let the system make it an actual quest as well. If you manage that, then you deserve whatever you get." At those words, a dull chime rang out, and the air shimmered. A notification popped up in front of Jonathan. "You have gained a quest. Baby Killer C. You have been tasked with killing a nest of waste goblins and their broodmother. Shame on you for accepting. Think of the little green monsters, their tiny claws, their sharp, blood-spattered teeth. Oh, that wasn't as endearing as I imagined it would be. Rewards: entry to Turan, 10 Leviathan marks. Jonathan sighed as he read the quest description. It seemed that the system liked to make fun of those under its jurisdiction. It was clearly a sapient being, but one that was alien to him. Anything that could function on so many wavelengths at once was something that was not human. Or elf, or orc, or whatever strange fantastical races inhabited this world. Also, if Jonathan wasn't mistaken, the system had purposefully made a sad face with the quest difficulty level. Sighing, he closed the interface and nodded at the others. Very well. Do you need some sort of proof? No, the system will handle all that, the male guard said. Jonathan turned around and walked away, before turning back, a wry smile on his face. I don't suppose you could point me to this nest. An hour later, Jonathan was standing outside of a hole in the ground. Every now and again, wafts of rancid air would come out of the hole, as if some gargantuan creature was breathing down there. Little green monsters, my ass, Jonathan thought. With a sigh, he approached the hole, holding his nose closed. The hole was more than wide enough for him to enter, not that he especially wanted to. Still, there was no other way to get what he needed. The dryness in his throat and hole in his gut were all the evidence that he needed for going in. Unless he wanted to eat monsters, he needed entry to Turan. As he descended into the hole, his feet landed in some wet, squishy substance. He was glad for the fact that there was barely any light in here. He wouldn't have liked what he saw there. Either it was excrement or something worse. This was yet another reason why he needed proper equipment. The smell got worse and worse the lower he went, until he could taste in his mouth, like a physical thing made out of malodorous vapors. A deep, rumbling snore could be heard coming from the base of the tunnel, and an unholy skittering noise. A minute later, Jonathan broke into a large cavern, filled with small green creatures. He summoned a mana flame to see better, immediately wishing that he hadn't. Other than the cursory resemblance to their description, they were certainly not, as the system had claimed, endearing. The little monsters were colored a disgusting shade of moss green, and their skin was mottled with sores and open wounds. Their claws extended a few inches out from their tiny, gnarled hands, and their teeth were clearly visible from here. They were most certainly blood-spattered. In the very center was a monstrously obese goblin twice the size of Jonathan, with its head tilted in slumber. When he entered, the bevy of goblins went still and looked in his direction, their eyes glinting in the light of his mana flame. A moment later, they were skittering across the ground towards him. Jonathan snarled as the living tide of green surged towards him, and he consoled himself with the fact that at least his martial arts abilities would work on these things. He got a quick head count as they approached, noting that there were about 15 of the creatures. They were all about half his height, but still tall enough for him to use his skills on effectively. As the first two reached him, Jonathan reached down with both hands and stepped through the gap between them, flipping the monsters with ease. His newfound strength made the motion trivially easy. Small, delicate bones cracked as he slammed the creatures into their brethren, eliciting reedy squeaks from the creatures. Then the main bulk of the group was upon him, and he was beset from all sides by scratching claws and rending teeth. Jonathan raised his hands in front of his face to protect himself and got to work. Each punch, propelled with a strength beyond his frame, took a goblin out of the fight, either stunning them or sending them a dozen feet into the distance. All the while, the broodmother remained slumbering, unaware that her children were being murdered as she slept. Then again, murder implied the idea that these things were not just mere monsters, they certainly did not seem sapient to Jonathan. In any case, it did not matter. He had killed a person once before, and he would do so again without hesitation if it was needed. Each application of his martial skill broke bones and tore sinews, rendering the creatures unable to fight effectively. It was a brutal means of combat, but one that Jonathan was quite adept at. He was nowhere near his limit, and the few scratches that had made it through his defense were worthless, unable to inhibit his motion. As he slowly worked through the weak monsters, one of them was sent flying towards the broodmother by an errant punch. As it landed on her ample stomach, the snoring cut off, and the creature opened one rheumy eye. Looking up, it wailed in rage as it saw what had happened during its slumber. The creature rose to its feet, grunting with effort, and howled at Jonathan. The goblins around him chortled and ran off, hiding in the far corners of the room. Jonathan quickly analyzed the beast in front of him, and his heart fell. This would not be a pushover. Goblin Broodmother, Elite. Level 19. It was only 2 levels higher than the Alpha Prowler had been, but it was of a different build to that creature, and it seemed to have a rudimentary intelligence. He cursed the unnamed guards from the city gates for sending him on this suicide mission. They had known full well that no normal level 12 could stand against a monster of this caliber. Hell, even Jonathan would be hard-pressed with this fight. The monster laughed and trundled across the ground towards him, her massive arms stretched out wide. The creature's frame might have been covered in lard, but Jonathan knew that it likely had its fair share of strength as well. He did not want to be caught by any attack this creature could dish out. As it approached, he widened his stance and summoned his mana balls, getting ready for a long and hard fight. The size and shape of the creature would render his mana-imbued attacks almost useless except against its head, which was 4 feet higher up than his own, and almost out of reach. He would have to whittle it down instead, fighting a war of attrition. Jonathan took a deep breath and leaned into the knowledge imparted to him by his martial arts pathway skill, preparing himself physically and mentally for the fight. The broodmother closed the last few feet with stunning speed, shaking the ground with every step. Jonathan got his hands up just in time to tank a punch to the face, an attack that sent him flying backwards, straight into the cavern wall. He let out a grunt as the air was driven from his lungs. As he had suspected, the broodmother was monstrously strong, despite its comedic form. The monster dashed in again, seeking to end the fight with another blow. Jonathan dodged and used the cavern wall to push off, catching the monster in the lower jaw with a vicious left hook, imbued with mana. The broodmother staggered backwards, her rolls of fat lightly seared. Then she smiled at Jonathan, exposing rows of serrated fangs. Each one of those fangs was stained black with ancient blood and detritus. The monster started gagging, as if it was choking on something, and then it vomited a spray of acidic liquid at Jonathan. A few drops landed on his bare flesh, and burnt down to the bone. He hissed in agony and distanced himself from the smoking and bubbling pile of acid on the ground next to him. Closing the distance rapidly, he ducked under 2 punches and began to pummel the monster rapidly in the stomach. It bent backwards at the force contained within Jonathan's attacks, and spat up greenish blood. He backed off as it slammed its meaty arms together, trying to catch him off guard. The monster growled in rage and barreled forwards, clipping Jonathan's shoulder with an outstretched fist. He spun with the attack, mitigating the force, and slammed his palm into the monster's back as hard as he could, dislodging vertebrae. The thing staggered, and whirled around, suddenly unable to move its limbs as quickly. It almost fell over, but kept its balance long enough to begin building up some sort of skill. Waves of green light cascaded over its form, and then sunk into its flesh. With a muffled thump, all of the fat on its form suddenly vanished, replaced with lean muscle. The creature stood at its full height for the first time, and at over 12 feet, it was an intimidating sight. Bearing those same blood-stained fangs, it blurred forwards, almost faster than Jonathan could see. Without pausing once, it slashed at him with long, matted claws, tracing a line of fire across his chest. His tattered clothes gave up the ghost, and his shirt fell off him, exposing his bare chest. The monster slashed again, but Jonathan held up one hand to block. The blow fractured his forearm, but allowed him to slam his palm into the monster's stomach, imbuing it with mana. Without the thick cushion of fat protecting the monster from him, the skill burnt straight through, a testament to his growing control over his mana. Howling in pain, the broodmother jumped backward, with a charred hole in its abdomen. Jonathan pressed his advantage, sending his other fist hurtling into the weakened area. His fist sunk into an organ, and blood spurted out around it. The stench was nauseating, and Jonathan realized that he had broken into the creature's stomach. Fighting in hand-to-hand combat was certainly a gruesome way to go, especially with his enhanced stats. Ripping his hand out, he danced backwards as a storm of claws descended upon the area he had just been in, the monster incensed by the pain he had put it through. He could tell that the battle was almost finished, and it had been quite a bit easier than he had expected. His talent for mana manipulation was really paying dividends now. Jonathan watched as the monster faltered, trying desperately to get to him. Somewhere within its mind, it realized that its only hope was to level up, which was unlikely, even if it did kill him, based on its current level. All he had to do was wait it out. However, Jonathan was impatient, and was hungry to test himself. Instead, he charged the beast, weaving through its weakened strikes, and planted both fists into the sides of its head. A wave of mana passed between them as the mana orbs made contact with each other, and Jonathan was blasted backwards, falling into unconsciousness. All he could hear was a long, drawn-out scream, which he belatedly realized was coming from himself. Jonathan awoke to a burning pain in his left leg. One of the goblins was gnawing on it, trying to break through his skin. However, his recent acquisition of a boon was stymieing its efforts, and all it had achieved was to bloody the skin a little bit. Jonathan reached down and picked the creature up, tearing it off his leg with ease. As it writhed and clawed at the air, he felt a sudden sense of emptiness. For the first time, he doubted himself. Did he really have what it took to slaughter his way through the infinite hells, growing stronger off the pain and terror of his prey? Could he stomach a kill streak that would eventually become innumerable? As he contemplated his meaning within this world, he realized that, yes, he could. He needed to break free of this terrible place, if he was to ever realize his full potential. The brief glance of the real world that he had gotten, of the rolling hills and the pastoral landscape, reminded him that none of this was real. Besides, even if this was a real place, everyone here were sinners. They were all going to die anyway, and Jonathan might as well be the one to kill them. In any case, he had some notifications to look over, to distract himself from the moralistic ramblings of his brain. You have killed a waste goblin broodmother. You have killed a waste goblin, X15. You have leveled up, X2. The rate of depreciation was slow, but his leveling speed was slowing down now. The thing that had put it over the edge likely had been him reaching level 10. Before that, killing such a powerful monster and its children would have given him far more power than he had gotten now. Still, it was a good boost, bringing his overall level up to level 14, and bringing his pot of stored stat points to 27. After the level up notification was one telling him that he had advanced in his mana manipulation skills, and he was now at novice rank 8. He was almost at the student rank, and the stat boost that would bring. Also, it was likely that he would gain a skill out of the matter, perhaps finally turning his mana ball attack into a system-registered technique like the redirection ability. The final notification was as followed. You have completed a quest. Baby Killer C. You have been rewarded with 10 Leviathan marks. Talk with the Turun City guards for entry. 10 of the dark metal coins that the guard had shown him dropped out of the air and into his palm. They were strangely warm, and had the disturbing texture of flesh, despite being made entirely out of metal. He pocketed them, and then realized that his pockets were all ruined beyond repair as the coins clinked to the ground beneath him. Sighing, he resolved himself to keep a hold of them, despite their foul texture. Taking one last good look at the cavern, Jonathan spotted a glint of metal from the far corner, coming out of a pile of filth. Walking over to it, he recognized it as a chain. It was connected to something buried in the waste, and Jonathan plucked it out gingerly. It was an amulet, emblazoned with a strange sigil. 13 black stars orbited a void, inexorably heading straight into its center. Jonathan quickly scanned it. Basic Amulet of Sarnathros. Tier 1. Magical item. An amulet imbued with the faith of its wearer over many decades, a small portion of energy has entered it, granting it supernatural power. All true believers in Sarnathros gain a minor bonus to all stats while wearing this object. Jonathan raised an eyebrow and put the amulet on, wiping off the filth from the end. As he slipped the chain over his head, a tiny rush of power entered him. There was no change on his stat sheet, but he could feel that he had gained a minimal amount of power, perhaps equal to a single extra stat point per stat. With his new treasure, Jonathan was ready to leave the cave. As he trudged up the narrow tunnel towards the surface, he studiously ignored the detritus squelching beneath him. Some time later, he approached the Turan city gates, happy to see that the same two guards were there. He drew near, and opened his arms wide in challenge. "Well, so I couldn't do it then." "Those goblins were weak," he said, noting the expressions of shock and concealed anger on the guards' faces. Sighing, they opened the gates behind them, letting him into the city. As the rusted iron gates creaked outwards, the city was slowly revealed, not that it could be really called a city. The ground was covered in trash, and the air was pervaded with the scent of rot. This was a town that had seen better days, although those days had probably still been dismal. The few denizens of the town looked up at him suspiciously before returning to their own paths, ignoring him. He walked into the city, and kept his eyes out for what he was looking for: food, water, and equipment. Now that he had some money, those things were within his reach. It was about 10 blocks by 5, and the houses were squat and low to the ground, with none of them taller than the wall. In the center of the town was a 2-story building, but even that was not any taller than the dark stone fortifications around the city. There was probably a reason for that. A nearby building seemed to have many more patrons than the rest, and Jonathan walked cautiously up to it, hearing the noises of muffled carousing coming from within. Even those noises seemed deadened and dreary, however, and the pervasive atmosphere of gloom that suffused this town was present even here. Jonathan walked into the tavern, and drew the eyes of everyone in there. The reasons were twofold. 1, he was a newcomer to this town, presumably a rarity in these parts. Nobody in their right minds would leave the safety of a town, not even to come to another. Secondly, he was covered in blood and viscera, and his shirt was missing. However, compared to some of the people here, he seemed comparatively well off. Quite a few men and women, of all sorts of exotic races, sported large masses of scar tissue, and their clothes were hardly in any better shape than his own. Ignoring the stares, he walked up the bar, making sure to skirt the patches of sticky liquid on the ground. Those were most likely from beer, but they could be worse. When he reached the bar, a greasy-looking man with a thin mustachio sidled up, raising one eyebrow at Jonathan. "A newcomer, I see. I'm surprised that the guards let you by. Those two Hardises barely let anything fun happen around here." The man shot his eyes over to the side, and Jonathan followed, laying eyes on a pair of scantily clad reptile women, both of whom were eyeing him up with hunger on their faces. He shook his head and looked back at the bartender, who seemed a little bit disappointed. "I'm not here for cheap thrills," Jonathan said, letting an edge into his voice. "I want supplies for my journey. Food, water, and some sort of proper clothing." "Ha! I can supply the first two, but for the latter, you'll need to talk with Tom. Just a friendly warning, he can be a bit grumpy at this time of the day." The man pointed at a swarthy fellow down in his cups at the end of the bar. As Jonathan studied him, he realized that Tom was a dwarf, or at least something similar to that. Jonathan walked slowly down by the bar, avoiding the careening drunks that lined it. One of them tried to reach for his pockets, but Jonathan slapped her hand out of the way, not sparing her a second glance. The woman blinked once, and then went back to her drink. Jonathan shook his head, and made it to his target without any further incident. Clearing his throat when Tom remained recalcitrantly buried in his drink, he prompted the man to look at him with an evil expression. "What the hell do you want, boy? I'm a busy man here. Leave me alone." "Yeah, Busy drinking your life away? Jonathan had dealt with people like this in the past, and the best way to break through to them was by flaring their emotions. Tom snarled and rose unsteadily to his feet, almost falling over. Jonathan calmly put out his hand, steadying the man. All he got for his efforts was an angry punch that came nowhere near hitting him. Are you quite done? I was told that you're the man to talk to for general supplies, Jonathan continued. The dwarf looked up at him with a crafty expression in his face, one that was not marred by his inebriated state. What's that to you? You got money to spend? Tom asked, smiling creepily. Jonathan nodded at the dwarf, who lit up suddenly with a radiant smile. Well, why didn't you say that before? Come with me, he said a moment later, his voice cheerful. The dwarf stumbled towards the door, and Jonathan haplessly followed him, noting that everyone else in the tavern seemed to be laughing at him. He had no idea of the various social dichotomies here, and hoped that he had not gotten himself into a bad situation. As soon as they left the tavern, he was suddenly beset by a band of dwarves, each wielding a small axe. The day was rapidly turning to night, and their features were hidden from Jonathan. What's the meaning of this? He spluttered, watching as Tom turned to face him. The only supplies that you'll be getting out of here is your life, and that's if you're lucky. Hand over all your money, or these streets will run red with your blood, Tom said, the cheerful note in his voice gone, with the drunkenness having disappeared. Jonathan sighed. This was all a ruse, wasn't it? The bartender points me to you, and then as soon as we get out of the bar, then you rob me and give him a cut. At least you weren't like the last would-be criminal I had to deal with. He didn't wait until we were out of the bar. Before the dwarves could respond to that statement, Jonathan was already upon the nearest one, darting past a hasty swipe of the man's axe and burying his fist into his face. The small man went tumbling backwards, blood spurting up from his ruined nose. Jonathan danced backwards as two axes whistled through the space he had just occupied, and he began to send mana to his hands. The two balls of concentrated energy popped into existence on the ends of his fists, and he began swinging at the dwarves, driving them back in fear of his power. Hey. Wait, there's no need to be so hasty. How about I give you some things, free of charge, and you let me walk away from here? Tom said, his voice quivering. Jonathan paused, and pretended that he was mulling over it, although his decision had already been made. He would go along with the dwarf, but first, it was time for a little payback. As he nodded his assent, he stepped forwards and punched the man as hard as he could in the stomach, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into a wall. The dwarf grunted as the air was forced out of his body, and Jonathan withdrew his hands to let him fall, gasping, to the filthy ground. I'll take you up on that offer, but I would advise more caution in the future from you, Tom, he replied, spitting out the dwarf's name. The next traveler might not be as lenient as me. Tom got to his feet, spitting out blood, and nodded in fear, meekly skirting around Jonathan. All right then. Come with me, he said, once his voice was back. The dwarf led Jonathan along the streets of the town, and towards a strangely shaped building propped up against one of the walls. It looked like a cross between a general store and a smithy, with a forge clearly visible from outside, peeking out between rows of shelves. At least the dwarf actually owned a store, and hadn't been lying about that too. First up was a rucksack, as he needed to have some way of carrying his equipment, if he ever got any, and also some proper shoes. His hardened skin from his boon was good for keeping his feet undamaged, but he didn't especially enjoy stepping in the nameless filth that lined the ground of the infinite hells. Spotting a pair of sturdy-looking leather boots, plated with iron, he walked over to them and took them off the shelf. Placing them on the ground, Jonathan tried them on, stunned when they adjusted their size to fit him. They had been a few sizes too large previously, but now they fit perfectly. In addition, his grip on the ground felt far surer than it had before. Are these enchanted? Jonathan asked Tom. Most of the goods in here have at least a minor enchantment. I acquired them from others like you, by relieving them of their belongings. If you want those, they're yours. Jonathan had half a mind to clear out the entire shop in order to punish the dwarf for his wrongdoings, but he realized that would be petty, and an utterly futile endeavor. There was no way for him to carry the items with him, and he would end up wasting them. He would rather only pick up things that he needed. With his new shoes, it was time to pick up some armor as well. Because of his fighting style, plate armor would be useless, not that he saw any here, so leather armor would have to do for now. Spotting a likely set hanging next to the forge, Jonathan padded over, his new shoes even reducing the sound of his footsteps, and pulled down the set of armor. Turning it over, and finding the buckles on it for loosening and tightening the fit, he tried it on. It was divided into a few different pieces, with a chest plate made out of boiled leather run through with strips of metal, leggings, and arm protectors. It looked a bit strange, but such was the cost of protection in this world. Jonathan quickly donned it, finding that it fit perfectly, and nodded in satisfaction. He was almost finished with his shopping spree, and the only thing he needed now was some sort of weapon. He actually liked his pugilist fighting style, as it meshed with his martial arts pathway skill effectively, but he still wanted something to make his blows stronger. Searching around the shop while Tom watched in barely concealed dread, he eventually found the perfect item. Nestled between a great sword and a pair of daggers was a pair of dark iron gauntlets, which had giant spikes affixed onto the ends, tipped with serrated barbs. Picking up the item, Jonathan almost dropped it because of its weight that belied its size. He put the gauntlets on, and immediately felt more powerful than before. If that amulet that he had found in the goblin nest had provided a few stat points, this one provided more than a dozen. He heard a muffled wail of despair from behind him, and he smiled. This was likely one of the most valuable items in the entire shop. At least he could get at the dishonest dwarf like this. He quickly analyzed the gauntlets, smiling as he read the description. Marauders Batterers. Tier 1 weapon, blunt. Twin dark iron gauntlets that are imbued with the spirit of a pugilist. These weapons are the perfect accompaniment to any martial path that eschews normal weaponry in favor of fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Using these weapons will even the gap, allowing you to fight against wielders of any other weapon. +6 to strength, +6 to dexterity while wearing. Jonathan slammed the weapons together, smiling as he did so. These were perfect. The last thing he needed was some food, as he doubted that the bartender back at the inn actually had any for him. Eyeing up cans of food on the shelves, he cleared out a good section, dumping them into his rucksack. Although it likely weighed over 50 pounds by the time he was done, it felt like almost nothing, because of his strength. With a cheeky grin at the shopkeeper, he left the building, leaving Tom fuming in a corner, enraged at his loss. Perhaps he could have come out on top if he had tried to deal with Jonathan normally, rather than attempting to rob him. Before he left this place, he had a grudge to settle. Walking down the streets, enjoying the new confidence that his gear instilled in him, Jonathan stopped outside of the tavern, and then kicked the door in. It flew off its hinges and he stepped through the portal, his eyes on the bartender. The man quivered in fear as Jonathan approached, and as he sent mana to his fists, finding that the gauntlets were able to conduct the energy, the man whimpered. "You set me up, you bastard." Jonathan roared at the man, spittle flying out of his mouth. "How about we settle this, here and now?" The man shook his head in terror, and Jonathan grinned wickedly, leaning over the counter. He snapped his hand out and gripped the man by his collar, pulling him over the counter and onto the ground. "Get up," he snapped at the man, readying a punch. The bartender quivered on the ground, and seemed to be crying. "Don't kill me, please," he whimpered. "I'll give you anything. Money, women, anything." Money, you say?" "I might be tempted to let you off if you pay me," Jonathan responded. The bartender nodded in fear and got to his feet, edging behind the counter as if Jonathan was about to hit him. Jonathan had half a mind to do that, but he restrained himself. It wouldn't be in good form to do something like that. As the horrified patrons watched the exchange, Jonathan turned to them. "Next time you see something like this happening, don't stand by. I don't know if a single one of you has a good bone in your body, but if you do, some changes need to happen in this town. This may be hell, but that doesn't mean that we have to be the demons." Jonathan's off-the-cuff speech had the desired effect on the people. Most of them cowered further, but he saw that a few of them seemed to have taken the words to heart. If he could convert even one person, he would have done a good job here. Turning back to the counter, he found himself facing a crossbow, locked and loaded. The bartender had his finger on the trigger, but before he could pull it, Jonathan grabbed the bow with his gauntlet hand, and snapped it in two with an expression of brute force. A moment later, his fist was planted in the bartender's skull, splattering gore over the back wall. Withdrawing his hand, Jonathan smiled as he saw that the blood slipped off the gauntlets like water. These weapons had been the best thing he had found in this forsaken world. Reaching over the counter and scooping up a pile of money that was lying there, Jonathan left the tavern, and walked out into the night. Standing on the hilltop overlooking the city, Jonathan took a deep breath. It seemed that the cities were just as bad as the wasteland around him. At least the monsters were honest about their desire to kill you. Looking back one more time at the town behind him, Jonathan could swear that he heard the sound of steel clashing with steel coming from the tavern. With a smile on his face, he left, walking off into the dark expanse of ash. 3 days, 4 cans of food, 2 levels, and 1 mana manipulation tier later, he was on the cusp of ranking up his pathway skill. Sitting in a cross-legged position beneath the remains of some gigantic bell, he poked and prodded at his core until he was able to draw out a massive tendril of mana. He experimented with it, weaving it in and out of his core, trying to see the limits of his power. Still, there was no rank up. He was doing the same thing that he had been doing before, and there was no greater understanding there. Just as he was about to give it up for the day, his frustration manifested by condensing a small tendril of the mana within his body. Jonathan froze, and looked at it closely. He had only tried to condense mana outside of his body before, but if he could do it within himself, then this could be the missing link between himself and the next rank. Taking a hold of his core with his mind, Jonathan crushed it together, straining as the orb started to shrink. Pain tore through his body from the core, but he knew that he was on the right path, so he continued. A few moments later, the core stabilized, about half of his previous size. His mana reserves had not been affected, but he could feel that his mana was much more powerful now than before. Also, he had a few notifications waiting for him. You have reached student rank 1 with mana manipulation. Taking hold of your core and manipulating it in the same way as external mana is a dangerous task, but one that brings great benefit. In doing so, you have begun to scratch the surface of your understanding. +3 to intelligence, +2 to wisdom. You have access to a skill. Mana Drill, rare. Condense your mana into a ball of energy that can burn through most substances. Accept? Y/N. Jonathan quickly hit yes, and found himself more attuned with his abilities with mana condensation. As with his martial arts skill, the rank up gave him an additional 5 stat points. It seemed that all student rank pathway skills would give the same amount. In any case, he had some major changes on his stat sheet, and he quickly opened it. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Basic. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 16. 33 free points. Strength. 70. Dexterity. 53. Constitution. 59. Resilience. 59. Intelligence. 60. Wisdom. 57. Divinity. 1. Health 590/590. Stamina 700/700. Mana 600/600. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, unique. Nascent Divinity, celestial. Righteous Killer, rare. Underdog, rare. Skills. Smite, legendary. Mana drill, rare. Redirect, uncommon. Identify, common. Pathway skills. Martial arts, student 3. Mana manipulation, student 1. Quests. Hellbreaker, impossible. His stats were increasing slowly but surely, and he was nearing 100 in his strength stat. All of his instincts told him that there would be something special waiting for him at that amount, but he did not know what. Closing his stat sheet, Jonathan leaned back, and began to test his new skill. The mana that he used for his skill came to him far more easily than before, and he wondered just how the system was able to increase his understanding of a skill by so much. Was it implanting information into his head? Or was it doing something else, something that he could not understand? Lowering his mana ball, which had grown even smaller than before, to the ground, he was met with a hissing noise as it ate through the rock like it was made out of butter. He could only imagine what it would do to human flesh. As he did so, he caught a glimpse of something strange out of the corner of his eye. In a slightly reflective part of the bell's surface, unmarred despite its many years out in the ash, he caught sight of strange sigils glowing in his eyes. Jonathan paused and moved closer, but the sigils were gone. He summoned his mana ball again, and the sigils returned. They were a shifting mess of three-dimensional tangles that were far beyond his ability to decipher. However, he could sense that there was great power in those sigils, far beyond anything any mortal was meant to understand. In the background, he could feel a sense of energy dropping, although none of his resources were budging, except for his mana, which was to be expected. When he saw a faint golden sheen on his skin, he realized that he was using up his divinity. He seized control of it, remembering using it against the fetid ooze, and the rate at which it was decreasing skyrocketed. For a few seconds, however, he understood a brief fraction of the meaning of the sigils. Then his mind gave out, and he collapsed backwards, into the ash. Jonathan woke up with a burning pain in his head, and a profound sense of wrongness that he could not put his finger to. Something had changed within him, and as he studied his reflection in the mirror of the bell's surface, he saw that his eyes were now golden. A new notification was waiting for him, but this one was different than all the others he had seen before. Rather than a simple message, it was edged in red, and when he moved to open it, something tried to stop him from doing so. He forced through the resistance, and read the message. You have gained a forbidden pathway skill. True Sight, Novice 1. You can see between the cracks in reality, utilizing your divinity to access the same interface as the system itself. As of now, you can comprehend tiny fractions of the universal sigil code, but who knows where this skill might lead. Warning. This is classified as a forbidden skill by the system. Relinquish it now or face extreme sanctions. Jonathan read the message and shook his head. He had gone through too much to get this skill, and it seemed like it was something groundbreaking, something that could render his quest possible. Another chime sounded. You will be rewarded for giving this skill up, you are its sole possessor, and there will be no help in mastering it. Jonathan shook his head again, preparing to close the interface. One final chime sounded. I will give you a one-time, unique reward in order to persuade you. You will gain power beyond your wildest dreams. He paused. That did sound tempting. Was it worth giving up something that was so clearly powerful that even the system did not want him to have it? He didn't think so. Closing the notification, he sighed. A moment later, extreme agony, the likes of which he had only ever felt once before, seized his body and soul. Blood dripped down his face, and his health bar began to drop. The system was punishing him for his transgressions, it seemed. Jonathan screamed, unable to keep a coherent thought in his head. The pain was too all-consuming for that. However, he caught sight of a hovering rune over his head in the reflection on the bell. It was pointed and tangled, and it radiated a sense of great evil. Without a doubt, that was what was killing him. With a surge of primal emotion, Jonathan screamed in rage, slamming his newfound ability into the rune with as much force as he could. His divinity evaporated like smoke, but a crack formed in the rune just as his will gave out. With a sound like shattering glass, the rune vanished, and he was left sitting there, with a mere 10 points of health left in his bar. True Sight has reached Novice Level 4. Unbinding that sigil had given him 3 ranks in the skill, and he tensed, sure that he was about to be beset by another rune, this time without the means to resist it. However, no such attack came, and he was left there, pondering what exactly this skill meant. It was clearly to do with his divinity, but it seemed that not even the gods had it, based on the way that the system had described it. Was it to do with his special status as an outsider? Could that have broken through some universal limiter, allowing him to catch a glimpse of the true meaning of everything? In any case, it seemed that the skill was not entirely passive, as he had been able to break that sigil. However, that had been a single rune, and when he studied the ones in his eyes again, he saw that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of intricately layered sigils there. Even just looking at it for a prolonged amount of time made his brain hurt, and he quickly deactivated the skill. That had been an entirely unexpected occurrence, but now that he had the skill, he wasn't sure what exactly he was supposed to do with it. Could he use it to empower himself in some way? Or was it only useful if the system attacked him? He knew that the myriad runes that were contained within his eyes were far beyond his ability to change, so he tried something else. Focusing on the ground in front of himself, Jonathan envisioned the twisted shape of the rune that the system had used on him. His enhanced intelligence meant that the memory was firmly entrenched in his mind, and he was able to draw it out with his finger and some ash. Even in its inert state the rune still looked dangerous, and it was like staring at a fragment of death itself. With a deep breath, Jonathan sent some divinity into the sigil. The one good thing about having low divinity was that it recharged extremely quickly. His energy poured into the sigil without stopping, almost bottoming him out. At the last moment however, it clicked into place, and the rune blazed with light. A wave of red energy surged out of the rune, washing over him. It did not harm him, but he heard a squeal from outside. Rushing out, he saw that one of the ash prowlers was leaning up against the wall, dead. His rune seemed to have worked. A notification chimed a moment later. You have learned the rune of hatred. This rune, powered by divinity, will kill any enemies within a certain radius. The radius, and the power of the rune, depends on the amount of divinity placed into it. It seemed that each rune had a different meaning, forming some sort of runic alphabet that could be used to do things. Looking at his runic pathways as he used his mana drill skill, Jonathan was just about able to recognize a few runes before his divinity gave out on him. He swayed, but managed to stop himself from collapsing, first. He had understood a few of the basic concepts imbued in a few of these runes, such as one that seemed to embody an aspect of connection, another that seemed made to stabilize the entire thing, and another that would channel power. He had made a small, but significant step, in understanding the runes. Another notification appeared, and he quickly opened it. You have gained a new pathway skill. Runecrafting, Novice 4. Build off your forbidden True Sight skill to not only understand the runes that make up the world around you, but edit them as well to your own desires. There are runes for every concept in existence, and finding them will be a monumental task. Jonathan grinned at this. Not only could he read the sigils that the system was so afraid of, he could also make them. All this time, he was so excited with his new abilities, that he did not notice the small rune hovering just out of sight behind his head. If he had studied himself in the mirror, he would have noticed it, but he was too distracted to do so. Instead, he packed up and left the safety of the bell. Nothing happened for a few hours, but eventually a faint rumbling noise started to be heard from the north. Jonathan frowned and paused, looking in that direction. A small cloud of dust was visible in the distance, but it seemed like it was getting closer. It almost appeared like some sort of sandstorm, but for the duration of Jonathan's stay here, he had been unaware of any sort of wind in the ash heaps. No, this was something else. Something that he did not want to be anywhere near. He began running for a nearby structure, looking for shelter from the coming storm. Hopefully the ruined castle that was in front of him was sturdy enough to stand up to whatever was coming. It was quite small, as castles went, but most of it was in serviceable condition, especially the walls, which were the most important part. He dashed through the splintered gate and raced up the stairs towards the top of the wall, trying to get a better vantage point. By this point, the cloud of dust was visibly larger than before, and he was able to pick out small flashes of motion within it. The motion of what looked disturbingly like titanic claws. For it to be visible from this distance, whatever those claws belonged to had to be incredibly large. Jonathan took a deep breath and crouched behind the wall, trying to make his profile as small as possible. Whatever was coming was certainly some sort of monster, and one far beyond anything Jonathan had dealt with before. As the earth began to tremble around him, he started to desperately search for a way out. There was no point in trying to outrun whatever was coming towards him, as it was far faster than him. All that would do was get him trampled or eviscerated by the claws that he had seen. None of his abilities were potent enough to stand a chance against that monster either, except for his new runecrafting skill, which was a loose cannon. It might do something to the monster, but it might also prove to be nothing more than an annoyance. The area of effect that the rune of hatred had covered had been about 20 feet, and it had been powerful enough to kill an ash prowler with ease. The only question was whether it was strong enough to hold against this monster. The main problem was that Jonathan only had a small amount of divinity available with which to empower the rune, but as far as he could tell, it was his only option. Sighing, he got to work drawing as many of the runes as he could. By the time that he had begun to imbue the first of the runes, the monster had come into sight. It was utterly terrifying. A 50-foot-tall reptilian creature, it was covered in lines of dark scales, and its many legs were topped with curved claws that looked sharp enough to cut a tree in half. 2 heads poked out of the top of its monstrous torso, each of which was crowned with a ridge of spikes. Jonathan quickly analyzed the monster, but only got question marks in response. Whatever this thing was, it was not Tier 1. An almost infinitesimal sense of wrongness had been niggling at Jonathan for the last few hours, and as he struggled to fill the runes in time, pushing himself beyond his limits. In terms of divinity expenditure, he finally found what had been bothering him. A tiny rune was floating on the back of his head, in a place where his mundane sight could not detect it. However, with enough divinity usage, he was able to see all the runes in his area, and not just those in front of him. It took up a good chunk of his stock, but he eventually figured out what it was. The rune was, at a glance, just as inscrutable as the rest of them, but as he peered into its depths, he felt a strange urge to draw closer to it, almost as if it was beckoning to him. The more he focused, the deeper into the rune he could see, until he eventually found a thin strand of power that led from its center off into the distance. Heading straight for the monster. Cursing, Jonathan slammed the remainder of his divinity into the rune, cracking it in half. Unlike the rune of hatred, this one was far less durable, as its purpose had been to remain unseen, rather than stand up to assault. However, even with the rune gone, the monster was still coming. He tried to imbue another of the runes in front of him, but the pain that ensued forced him to stop. For runes of hatred would have to be enough. Now that the tracking rune was gone, perhaps he had a chance of escape. He jumped up and down on the top of the wall, screaming at the top of his lungs. The monster snorted, blowing up a cloud of ash from the plain, and changed trajectory, heading for him, and the runes. Jonathan ducked out of the fight and leaped off the side of the wall, hiding in the shadow of the castle. The 30-foot drop caused his legs to twinge painfully, but nothing more. His durability was more than up to the challenge. As he began running for another ruin, he heard the monster slam into the castle wall behind him. There was the sound of shattering stone, and then a deep, sonorous chime as the runes went off. A blast of red energy tore across the monster's flesh, burning it severely. The blast petered out after reaching to the creature's heads, but it had served its purpose. Jonathan had reached safety, or rather, a place to hide. The monster bellowed in rage and pain, shaking the earth with a thunderous stomp of anger. It charged off into the distance, unable to find Jonathan now that the rune was gone. With a sigh of relief, he sank backwards, letting the embrace of sleep take him. He had overextended his divinity one too many times. When he awoke, he was greeted by the welcome sight of notifications on his system interface. TrueSight has reached Novice 6. Runecrafting has reached Novice 9. Unfortunately, he had been too busy with the hatred runes to be able to memorize the new rune that the system had used on him, but it was alright. He was almost at the next rank of his runecrafting skill, and he was looking forward to seeing what sort of bonuses he would get from it. It had already proven its power many times over, and even though he had been unable to inflict any serious damage on the monster, just the fact that his runes had been able to hurt it had been enough. He had felt a heavy weight on his soul when the monster came near, almost as if its presence was resonating with some part of him. He was sure that it would have killed him in an instant, as sure as he was of his own existence. In any case, he had survived. Another notification waited under the first two, and this one was even more welcome than the first two. You have gained 1 point in divinity. If he had to guess, his overextension of his abilities had led to this. Now he had enough to make more runes. Jonathan slowly rose to his feet, feeling as good as new, and made his way out of the ruin he was hiding in. The monster was long gone now, and the only trace of it was a set of gargantuan footprints leading off towards the horizon. If not for those, it could have been nothing more than a dream. The only thing that Jonathan had learned from that encounter was that he needed to get stronger, and quickly at that. His leveling speed was diminishing, and he needed to find a way to rectify that. The only way he could think of was through extreme danger. All of his greatest gains had come from fighting monsters beyond his level, sometimes by more than double. Jonathan clenched his fists in his gauntlets and prepared himself for the task ahead. A few hours later, he was standing in front of the telltale hole of another nest of waste goblins. This hole was a bit larger than the last, and hopefully that meant that there were more monsters inside. Jonathan stepped forwards and descended through the tunnel, using his mana as a light. He was inordinately grateful for his boots, which protected him from the filth on the ground. As with the last burrow, all of the monsters were waiting in a cavern at the base of the tunnel. This time, he did not give them a chance to attack first. He was both stronger and faster compared to the last time he had taken out a nest of these foul creatures, and these ones were only marginally stranger. However, there was one main difference, which was that next to the broodmother, there was a much larger version of the regular goblins. It was dressed in tattered leather armor, and held a long spear. Scars crossed its face, and it was covered in rippling green muscles. When it saw Jonathan ripping into the smaller goblins, it roared, and charged, flying across the ground. In between smashing one goblin's head into dust, and breaking another one's arms, he analyzed the new creature. Waste Goblin Stud, Elite. Level 25. Well, that solved the mystery of how exactly the broodmothers were impregnated. It seemed that one of these creatures came around every now and again to add to the litter. However, it was not just some breeding partner, and the creature actually seemed to have a degree of sapience to it. When it reached Jonathan, it made sure to avoid the goblins on the ground, which were presumably its children, and barged into him. The creature was far stronger than he had expected, and Jonathan was sent flying backwards into the wall of the cavern. He raced forwards, and ducked under the spear as it came whistling towards his head. Jonathan reached up and latched onto the weapon, trying to wrest it out of the stud's hands. The monster grinned and kicked Jonathan in the stomach, driving the wind out of him. He did not let go, however, and he used the momentum to pull the spear out of the goblin's hands. Reversing it in his own hands, Jonathan stabbed forwards, but he missed. He had no experience with a spear, and the unwieldy weapon was like a deadweight in his arms. Instead of discarding it, where the goblin could reclaim it, Jonathan instead broke it over his knee as the monster charged him. Throwing the pieces into its face, he rushed forwards, punching towards its gut. His spiked gauntlet landed with the force of a gunshot, tearing through the skin and organs of the monster. It howled in agony and lashed out wildly, catching Jonathan in the face with a blow. Some of his teeth cracked, but he ignored the pain, simply spitting out the fragments before they could become a choking hazard. Jonathan tore his gauntlet free, and channeled mana into his other hand, creating a mana ball. His new mana drill skill made sure that it was far more powerful than it had been the last time he used the ability in combat. Punching forwards with the skill in full swing, he drove a devastating uppercut into the monster's jaw. Superheated mana ate through the flesh and bone, boiling blood and sinew away. The stud gurgled and grabbed Jonathan's hands with its own, forcing them down. Now Jonathan was in trouble, as the monster tried to force the mana into his own skin. Jonathan banished the skill before he injured himself, and bent his knees, throwing the monster over his shoulder. Using his redirection skill, he imbued even more power into the movement than was there previously, and when the goblin landed, bones broke. Jonathan followed through with the attack, driving his fists into the monster's face and head. Bones shattered, and brain matter spilled out onto the floor as he killed the beast, sending a wave of essence into him. Breathing in deeply, he regarded the other monsters. There was no level up yet, and it seemed as if one could not level up in combat, but that was all right. Jonathan flashed forwards, destroying the rest of the goblins in front of him, who had stopped to watch the fight. They let out squeals of anger as he approached, but he did not listen, instead focusing on his own breathing. Finally the broodmother got to its feet, having banked on the stud's ability to win against Jonathan. However, it was too late for the monster, and Jonathan was already upon it, punching with all of his might. The monster tried to shift into its fighting form, but his piledriver of a fist slammed into its cheek first, driving straight through the flesh and into the skull. The bones beneath his hand cracked, and his own bones creaked in protest. He banished all thoughts of the pain, and instead punched with his other fist, driving the monster's head into the spikes. It punched him in the gut, squashing one of his organs, but he was undeterred, pushing his hands together with all of his might. The monster's head cracked open like an egg between his gauntlets, and a tidal wave of energy entered him. As soon as it did so, his wounds started to heal over, and the pain in his stomach faded to nothing. You have killed a waste goblin broodmother. You have killed a waste goblin stud. You have killed a waste goblin, X18. You have leveled up, X2. Jonathan smiled as the sweet power rushed into his body, filling him up. He was slowly becoming so addicted to the rush, that he would do anything to facilitate it. In the world of Telvaria, such people either died an early death, or went on to become the greatest of warriors. There was no in-between path. Jonathan closed the notifications, and sat down for a moment, recovering some of his energy. Although he had been fully healed by the level up, it did not fully restore his resources, and his stamina was quite low. As it recovered, he tracked the rate of recovery, interested in what determined that. Unlike with mana, where wisdom dictated the recovery rate, there was no stat for stamina that did the same thing. He was recovering around 7 points per second however, and eventually he realized that he was gaining his strength stat divided by 10 in points per second. At that rate, it would take him 100 seconds to reach full capacity, and as he thought about it for a moment, he noticed that would always be the rate, no matter how powerful he got. In any case, at least he didn't have to worry about another stat with stamina, instead being able to focus on strength. With his pugilistic abilities, he would be able to utilize every point into that stat to the utmost. Saving his spare points indefinitely was tempting, but as he was drawing closer and closer to 50 spare points, he realized that it would be time to invest them eventually. In another 4 levels, he would have a hair over 50 points to spend, and he had a plan this time. As he leveled, he had learned that the way his stat multiplier worked was through rounding. If he invested, say, 2 points into a stat, he would gain 2.5 points, which would be rounded up to 3. This actually meant that investing points incrementally rather than all in one go was the way to go, at least until his multiplier grew larger, which would make larger sums of points more effective. Still, he wanted to bank the points until he really needed them, as he certainly did not now, judging by the devastation that he had caused to the goblins. Jonathan got up a few seconds later, his stamina back to full, and explored the cavern. All that was in this one however was filth and detritus, and nothing of any real value. With a sigh, he headed back up the tunnel towards the surface. This was only the beginning of his journey to the top. In a tiny fishing village in the country of Landran, a principality of the Harine Empire, a little girl stared up at the sky in astonishment. All across the planet of Telvaria, people stopped and stared at the majestic sight up above. High up in the heavens above, flares of blinding light could be seen by the inhabitants of the planet. Galaxies and stars were being snuffed out by the titanic battle overhead. The gods were at war. Sarnathros was on his final breath, and his siblings had grown impatient with him, deciding to take the fight straight to the god himself. Even with their power carefully restrained, they were skirting on the edge of breaking reality itself. As they fought across the universe, erasing everything that they touched with their incredible power, something had to give first, either one side, or the universe. Eventually, Sarnathros collapsed from exhaustion and his injuries, falling onto a neutron star. The intense gravitational field of the celestial body barely moved a hair on his head, and all around him the gods of the light touched down. "Brother! It is over." Malaraxia, the queen of the sky's voice was suffused with regret, but also with an undercurrent of joy. After eons of war, the god and her allies had achieved their goal. They had brought their brother to his knees, and with that, their rule would be absolute. He had always been the strongest among them, and the litany of wounds that covered the bodies of the other gods, some of them irreversible, were a testament to his strength. However, in the end, it had been too much for him. As he lay there dying, he whispered the words to a forbidden incantation under his breath. With his last breath, his soul fled out of his body, and plummeted straight down, towards the infinite hells. Jonathan lay sleeping in the shelter of a monolithic tower, when he was jolted awake by a sudden twinge in his side. He rubbed at the pain, but as it began to increase, he scrambled to his feet. Nothing was attacking him, as far as he could tell, and there were no malefic runes nearby. He doubled over as his skin began to glow, and a moment later, a pillar of light lanced down from the sky, blasting his body with energy. Then it vanished, leaving only a faint smell of ozone. Jonathan stumbled, and then patted his side again. The pain was gone, but in its place was a rune beyond anything he had ever seen before. It was so complicated that his eyes began to bleed from even glancing at it. He tore his gaze away before madness claimed him, and tried to marshal his furiously beating heart. A moment later, a voice sounded in his head. "Jonathan! I did not wish to meet you like this, but here we are. A man, and a broken god." Jonathan froze, and waited to see if the voice returned. Perhaps he was going insane. "No, you are not going insane. I am Sarnathros, your divine patron. Events have come to pass that had rendered me nothing more than an unhoused soul, with none of my previous power. I was forced to flee here, and it was only pure luck that allowed me to enter your body. So what, you're possessing me now? I'm not sure if I am comfortable with that. Well, necessity demands that you get comfortable, because I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. It will take time for me to recover even a fraction. Oh. You are now the host of a Tier 1, Tier 100, divine entity. That entity has sent a tiny fraction of their latent power into you. +3 to all stats. There were many things to unpack from that statement. First and foremost was the fact that apparently Sarnathros was Tier 100, which meant that he was 98 tiers stronger than the monster that Jonathan had heard so much about, Granath. Secondly was the stat bonus. At least he was getting something out of this exchange. It had come entirely out of left field, but now that the shock had passed, Jonathan realized the more wide-ranging implications of this. Sarnathros had died, and his soul had somehow made its way down to the hells. Jonathan may well have been the last person that would ever talk to the god in person. Still, Jonathan was not beholden to the god. Perhaps initially, he was meant to be, but now he had a different purpose, one that was far grander. He was meant to break the infinite hells. If in doing that, he fulfilled his original objective, then that would be all well and good. If not, well, by the time this was over, he would be too powerful for anyone to mess with. Flashing one last curious glance at the intricately carved rune on his side, Jonathan was jolted by a spark of intense pain. He had no idea how simply looking at the rune, without even using his true sight, was so painful, but it was the creation of a being so far beyond him that he was nothing more than a bacteria in the face of his might. Well, technically he was just as strong as Sarnathros, or at least at the same tier, but the god was in a highly diminished state. Well, I guess that happened, he said, diffusing the tension within him. Shaking his head, he left his hiding place. He would not be able to fall asleep again after something like that. He spent the next few days exploring the ash heaps, flitting between ruins, and trying to raise his level as quickly as he could. He also made quite a bit of progress on his runecrafting and true sight abilities, and even managed to get a few tiers on his martial arts and mana manipulation abilities. Neither of them leveled especially quickly, now that they were in student rank, but he still managed to bring them both up to student rank 4. Jonathan had picked a majestic tower to upgrade his 2 abilities to their next level, and was in the middle of deliberating on the best way to do this. He knew quite a bit about the 2 concepts now, but only in the most basic sense. He was now able to use them almost effortlessly, but there was a lack of greater understanding that he sensed would come with a rank up. Instead of getting frustrated, he channeled his focus into pondering on the meaning of the 2 skills. Runecrafting was a derivative of his other skill, true sight, and they were intrinsically linked. Without true sight, runecrafting was worthless, and without runecrafting, he couldn't make sense of the runes that he found. He first isolated the concept of true sight in his head. It was an ability that allowed him to parse and use the runes that the system used to create skills, but it also seemed that it could be used for offensive purposes. He could also use those runes as well. At a basic level, the skill was simply what it said it was, a way to see beyond the veil of reality, and catch a glimpse of the hidden meaning of everything. However, there was far more to it than that. The skill was too closely linked to runecrafting for them to be anything other than closely related things. Over the next few minutes, he slowly realized that they were not just related, they were the 2 sides of the same coin. There was no reason for a skill to be broken up into parts that without each other, they were useless. It should be one cohesive entity, not 2 parts. As he began to direct his mind towards exploring the similarities between the 2 skills, he gradually found that the system had been deceiving him. In separating the 2 skills, it had placed a limiter by him, one that he had not been aware of until now. Neither could be used to their truest potential separately. However, the rigid skill constructions that the system created were already in place within Jonathan, and only editing the skills directly would achieve the result that he wanted. He knew that was a task that was far beyond his abilities at the moment, and he eventually gave up. Instead, he settled for the sudden rush of insight that he gained after studying the 2 skills closely. It turned out that the realization of how intrinsically linked they were was the key to student rank. You have reached student rank 1 with true sight. Your insatiable quest for forbidden knowledge knows no bounds. In continuing to explore your abilities, you have found an intrinsic connection between this skill and the ability to create and manipulate runes. For they are one and the same. +5 to wisdom. You have access to a skill. Focused Scry, rare. Burn a larger amount of divinity to empower your true sight abilities beyond their natural limiter. Accept. Y/N. Surprisingly enough, the derivative skill was only rare rank, but Jonathan supposed that the system was refusing to admit that it had been stymied by him. This also showed that the system, while being extremely powerful, was bound by strict rules. Next up was runecrafting. You have reached student rank 1 with runecrafting. Your insatiable quest for forbidden knowledge knows no bounds. In continuing to explore your abilities, you have found an intrinsic connection between this skill and the ability to see the fabric of reality. For they are one and the same. +5 to intelligence. You have access to a skill. Runes of Power, rare. Increases the power and stability of your runes by a small amount. Accept. Y/N. Jonathan quickly accepted the skill, and closed his eyes, trying to see if he could detect a difference between his runecrafting skills prior to the skill and after gaining it. Feeling no increase in his comprehension, he assumed that it was a passive skill. The only way to test it would be to draw out a rune and see just how effective it was. It wasn't hard choosing which rune, since he only knew one to a degree sufficient to creation, and he got working on the rune of hatred. This time, his subconscious made subtle alterations to the rune, adding a few lines here and there that served no apparent purpose. When he finished, and imbued it with divinity, the rune glowed brighter than it ever had before. He had made sure to only use half of his divinity pool, so as to create an accurate test of his abilities, since he had gained another divinity point lately. The amount of energy that he had from his divinity did not appear on his stat sheet, but he assumed that it was the same as his other resources, which was 10 points per stat point in divinity. Unfortunately, he could only raise the stat by special means, and he could not add points to it, but it seemed as if even the tiny amount that he had was capable of working great wonders. Jonathan got to his feet, and walked around the glowing rune, feeling a subtle sense of dread just by looking at the thing. It was even more imposing than before, and his metaphysical senses were shaking in terror of it. Instead of retreating, he smiled. This would be a new and powerful addition to his arsenal. The only thing he had to do now was to find a test subject, willing or otherwise. Leaving the rune and his rucksack behind, Jonathan ran out into the ash heaps, and quickly found a likely target. A lone ash prowler slunk between the ruins, clearly malnourished. Its bones were poking out from beneath its skin, and its face was gaunt and haggard. When it spotted Jonathan, it bayed in desperate rage and started looking towards him. Jonathan smiled at the approaching ash prowler and started running back towards his hiding place, at a rate that the beast could catch up. Far from the days that one of those beasts would have been able to chase him down with ease, now he was the one who had to regulate his speed for it to catch up. A few minutes later, the beast began to flag, the exertion too much for its weakened form. Jonathan waited patiently, as there were no more monsters around for him to use the rune on. This was the only one nearby that suited his testing parameters. It recovered its stamina soon enough, and it followed him the rest of the way to the site of his rune. Jonathan sat down next to the glowing mark on the ground, and waited for the monster to come. As soon as it came within range, it leaped at him, claws and jaws extended to their fullest. He rolled to the side, and the monster landed on the rune. An explosion of red light blinded Jonathan for a moment, and when it cleared, all that was left of the prowler was a skeleton, without a scrap of skin left. Ash drifted from the air to the floor, which was a fitting end for the creature. The results were far more than anything Jonathan had been expecting, and he realized that he was receiving a passive buff to his abilities simply by virtue of having ranked up, never mind the skill. That was just icing on the cake. The rune itself was still the same, but it seemed tidier and more exact, more aligned with the actual concept of hatred. Would he be able to eventually make a perfect rendition of the concept? If he was able to do that, he sensed that he would be able to channel power beyond anything he had ever seen or heard of. Creating that rune, which Jonathan was sure would have prompted a level up of his runecrafting abilities, or even several, prior to reaching student rank, did not even contribute to a single increase. Still, the heightened power was a boon in and of itself, meaning that Jonathan was glad of his new power. Even better, he had gained full credit for the killing of the monster, which sparked an idea in his mind. Over the course of the next few hours, Jonathan worked on creating a complex trap in the middle of the desert. Utilizing his enhanced capabilities to their maximum, he dug a pit deep into the ash, using his gauntlets to fracture any rocks that got in his way. By the time he was finished, he was greeted with a 10-foot deep by 20-foot wide hole in the ground. He jumped down into the hole, and began to fuse the sides together with his mana, turning it into a glassy rock-like substance. This quickly bottomed out his mana, and he experienced a feeling that he never wanted to feel again. Upon reaching 0, a spike of pain was driven through his head, along with a sudden surge of intense nausea. It dissipated over a few moments, but the memory was sufficient for an age. The mana recovered quickly enough, and he soon forced the memory out of his mind for the time being. He could not let fear of that happening again distract him from his purpose here. Eventually the walls were entirely smooth, and he leaped out, grabbing onto the top of the hole and levering himself upwards. All around the trap, he created runes, imbuing them with his divinity as quickly as he could. He had to wait for it to refill, but eventually he had about 20 runes surrounding the pit. Finally, he created sloped ramps on the side of the pit from his mana and bit more of the ash. Hopefully this would cause the corpses of the monster he found to slide down into the pit, and it would also make it so that after a rune was exhausted, a monster could still be forced into the pit, where it would become easy prey for him. Not that they weren't already, but he still had his limits, and if he had to fight, say, a dozen ash prowlers, he would prefer for them to be in a place away from him. Perhaps he could even use them as a means to work towards creating a ranged skill. He did not want to have to solely rely on his martial abilities, however effective they were. He finally finished up, just as the sun was starting to go down, which was perfect for his needs. It would conceal the pit, and the light of the runes would make it impossible to see in any case. He suspected that strange lights were not an uncommon occurrence in this world, and he assumed that it would be less of a deterrent than the pit. However, he tried to cover one of them up with ash, just in case. The ash blew off the rune as if under the influence of a strong wind, and he quickly learned that it was impossible to hide the rune fully. Even when he placed a large slab of stone over the rune, the light somehow shone through. He suspected that there was a way to hide them, but he didn't have the patience or the time to look for such a thing. Instead, he surveyed his handiwork, and ran out into the night. Using his mana as a light to see by, he quickly scouted the area for targets. 2 troops of ash prowlers were within the immediate vicinity, of about a mile, and he quickly made himself known to them by darting in and punching the weakest members of the groups. Howling, the packs followed him, which was perfect. As he dashed across the Stygian darkness of the ash, with his mana the only light in the gloom, he smiled, feeling alive. As the howls and cries of the prowlers behind him echoed over the wastes, he could only think of the influx of essence that he would be receiving soon. A few minutes later, he was back at the pit, the monsters following eagerly behind him. As soon as he reached it, he leaped over the hole in the ground, the runes unable to hurt him as he had created them. The ash prowlers on the other hand, however. Explosions of red light broke through the darkness behind him, and pained cries quickly faded into nothingness. A series of high-pitched baying noises came from it, and Jonathan doubled around to see that his trap had worked spectacularly. Out of the 20-odd monsters that had chased him, barely a quarter of them were still alive, and they were trapped in the pit. Jonathan made his way over to the pit, and realized that he had nothing to fear from the few stragglers that were left behind. Most of them were injured from the sudden drop and the backlash from the runes, meaning that they would be easy prey. Dropping down among them, Jonathan quickly butchered the monsters with swings of his gauntlets, briefly lighting up the pit every time he used his mana abilities. Barely a minute later, the battle was over, and a rush of essence entered him. You have killed an ash prowler, X20. You have leveled up. The battle only gave him a single level, but considering the fact that the monsters had been lower level than him, it was better than he could have hoped. More importantly, his runecrafting skill had leveled up. You have reached student rank 2 with runecrafting. Unfortunately, True Sight did not follow, but the skill was far less intensive than runecrafting, meaning that it would take longer to level it up. Simply looking at runes did not give the same amount of experience as actually crafting them, it seemed. Happy with his gains, Jonathan decided to reuse the trap. The trap worked perfectly over the next few days, and he was able to gain 3 more levels, but eventually the amount of essence that he was gaining slowed to a crawl. It was that, more than anything else, that led to Jonathan deciding to seek out bigger game. This would prove to be a rash decision, but for the time being, he was confident in his abilities. His plan was to muddle through the creation of the beckoning rune that had led the massive monster to him, using his expertise and knowledge of runes to piece together the gaps in his memory. He quickly got to work, and found that he was able to recreate about 90% of the rune. It was the last 10% that eluded him, however. The middle part of the rune, the most complicated part, was what he did not remember, and as he looked over the inert and incomplete rune, he started to apply his knowledge to it. The manifold whirls and twists that made up the rune might have seemed meaningless to an untrained eye, but Jonathan quickly recognized similarities to the rune of hatred. Despite the difference between the runes, it seemed that they shared similar roots. He began to fill in the missing pieces, using parts of the rune of hatred's center, and his intuition. Eventually, he was confident in the recreation of the rune, and he sent divinity into it. Nothing happened. Frowning, he studied the rune again. There was a tiny piece missing in the very center, one that he ended up replacing with the center piece from his other rune. It was an imperfect solution, but he was relatively sure that it would work. When he flooded the rune with divinity, it glowed, and began to exude a subtle sense of belonging. It was far weaker than the previous rune had been, and Jonathan knew that he had butchered the construction, but it still functioned regardless. You have learned the rune of temptation. This rune, powered by divinity, will lure in any living entities within a certain radius. The closer one is to this rune, the stronger the effect, the radius, and the power of the rune, depends on the amount of divinity placed into it. This rune added another level to his runecrafting skill, which was welcome. The noises of monsters began to drift over the horizon, and Jonathan realized that the rune was working. It was nowhere near powerful enough to lure in one of the massive monsters that it had the first time, but he did not want that anyway. He destroyed the rune with a quick divinity overload, and created a new one in the center of the trap. There was no time for him to make as many runes of hatred as the last time, seeing as the monsters were already on their way, but he was able to get 5 down on the ground before the first of the monsters arrived. Jonathan hid behind a nearby tower, and watched as dozens of beasts began to cluster around the pit, gazing longingly at the rune in its center. The first of them began to move towards it, setting off the hatred runes. An explosion of red light ripped through the monsters, killing over 10 in a single attack, but still more were coming. As the rest of them began to pile into the pit, Jonathan realized with a sinking heart that he had miscalculated. The pit was far too small for so many monsters, and soon they had covered the rune with their bodies, muting the effects. Even worse, a few elites had joined the fray. Those monsters seemed almost unaffected by the rune, instead spreading out around the area, somehow able to sense Jonathan's presence. It was time for him to make a break for it. Leaving the tower he was in, he ran for his life. A moment later, howls coming from behind him told him that he had been unsuccessful. For elite Alpha Ash Prowlers were coming in hot pursuit, and despite all the levels that he had gained since facing an Alpha last, they were still faster. Jonathan readied himself for a prolonged chase, and he darted from side to side, trying to confuse the creatures. They were smarter than the normal Ash Prowlers, however, and they were able to keep up with him, no matter how he tried to evade them. They clearly had excellent night vision, and even when he banished his guiding light, they were able to keep pace with him. His senses had been enhanced since coming to the infinite hells, and he was able to pick his way across the ash with consummate ease, but he knew that the monsters following him were even better at this than him. Instead of trying to outplay them at their own game, he decided to turn the tables. Turning around just in time to see the 4 creatures tearing across the ash, illuminating it with the light of their fiery attacks, he leaped into the air. The fireballs passed under him, melting the ash in their path. As they landed, they continued to blaze, setting a flickering light over the surrounding area. Jonathan raised his fist, and headed straight for the nearest of the alphas. These monsters were not the same as the first alpha he had fought, however, and they were all at least 7 levels higher than it had been, with the strongest of them 10 entire levels greater. Still, he would have been able to deal with any of them individually, if with some difficulty. All 4 at once was a death sentence, however, even with all of his power. Even worse, there was no way for him to set down any runes, and he suspected that doing so would have been futile in any case, seeing as these monsters possessed a modicum of intelligence. Instead, he would have to batter them into submission with martial skill and grace. As he headed towards the closest monster, his hands glowing with energy, the other 3 flanked him, growling low in their throats. Their fireball skills seemed to be on cooldown, but their razor-sharp claws and jaws would kill him just as easily. As his target snapped at him, Jonathan weaved to the side, barely missing the attack. He punched as hard as he could, catching the beast in the side of its rib cage, sending it rolling over the ash. He had felt bones break beneath his blow, but as the monster got to his feet, he knew that it had not been enough. The other 3 rushed him at the same time, burying him under their fetid bodies. They tore at him as they writhed in a heap above him, their attacks slicing through his leather armor with ease. Lines of red-hot pain formed across his body, and he could feel blood dripping down his front and back. Pushing his hands up into the morass of bodies, he forced his mana into the beasts, melting their flesh. 2 of the creatures withdrew, howling in pain, but the 3rd remained, snapping at Jonathan's hands with its jaws. It caught them in a tight grasp, and he was unable to turn his mana to bear at the monster. Even worse, the first monster was coming towards him, having recovered somewhat from its broken bones. Escaping this would require a drastic effort. Jonathan took a deep breath and yanked his hands backwards, tearing the flesh off his bones in the process. He screamed in pain, and turned the agony into red-hot rage, rage that kept him moving through the pain. He slammed one palm into the base of the alpha's skull, sending the odor of cooking flesh wafting across the ash. Leaping backwards, he avoided another monster's leap, letting the 2 creatures crash into each other. Regaining his confidence, Jonathan tried desperately to ignore his lifeblood pumping out of his body with each beat of his heart. The veins and arteries on his right wrist had been almost completely severed, and the blood coursed out of him in a torrent. Still, he was a lot more durable than any normal human, but he only had about another 10 minutes to live, if even that. He would have to up his game if he was to have even a chance at surviving this.